Hey guys, tonight you find yourself in the grey hush before dawn, in a low timber house where the smoke never fully leaves the rafters and the cold has a habit of climbing into your sleeves before you are properly awake. The straw beneath you is flattened, faintly damp, and carrying that familiar scent of dust, sheep's wool, and old winters that never quite passed. A cracked shutter lets in a seam of river mist, and somewhere beyond the yard a dog gives one suspicious bark, as if even now he's not entirely convinced you belong here. The rushes on the floor whisper when you shift your boots, stiff with yesterday's mud, and the faint bell of a distant priory counts an hour no one in this cottage can afford to ignore. Medieval travel brochures really oversold this experience. You probably would not last a week out here, not with the cold stone underfoot, the soot in the air, and the certainty that every morning begins long before comfort does. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and do leave a comment with your location and local time, so it feels as though we are all waking together in different corners of the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You do not rise all at once. No one does, not in weather like this. First there is the small negotiation with your joints, then the careful pull of your cloak around your shoulders, then the slow planting of your feet into the cold. The house is not silent, only half asleep. Someone shifts on the other side of the room. A child mutters into a wool blanket. In the ashes, one ember is still alive, though it glows with a kind of weak determination usually seen in overworked saints and underfed hens. You crouch by the hearth and breathe on it, then feed it a curl of kindling, then another. Soon a tiny flame starts to lick upward, timid as a novice entering a monastery library. The light it gives is poor, but poor light is a medieval specialty. It touches the iron pot hanging low, the oak chest against the wall, the worn stool by the loom, and the upright distaff leaning like a patient old aunt in the corner. The loom itself waits in shadow, large and still, a familiar wooden shape that fills the room even when it does nothing. By day it will creak and answer every movement you make, for now it only stands there, solemn and slightly judgmental, like a lord who has noticed you are late even when you are not. Outside, the air holds that wet cold smell of riverbank mud and trampled hay. You ease open the door and step into the yard. Frost has touched the bucket rim. The fence posts shine silver in the half-light. Beyond them, the village is still mostly dark, its roofs crouched low under the last of the night. Here and there a chimney is already smoking. Somewhere a rooster tries to sound heroic and mostly manages to sound offended. From farther off comes the bell again, this time clearer, carrying across fields and hedges from the priory on the rise. The monks ring the hours whether the world is ready or not. You sometimes think bells are how the rich and holy make sure the poor keep moving. Your first breath outdoors stings. Your second settles into you. You cross to the water barrel, break the skin of ice at the edge with your knuckles, and splash your face. It is not refreshing so much as educational. It teaches you, very firmly, that you are alive. Your hands come away aching with cold. There is no mirror here to tell you what you look like, but you know well enough hair flattened oddly on one side, eyes not yet ready for daylight, cheeks roughened by weather, sleeves carrying the smell of sheep and smoke in equal measure. The lane beyond the yard is a ribbon of mud with yesterday's cart ruts hardened at the edges. A broken wheel still leans near the ditch where someone left it 2 days ago. promising to return with tools and strong language. No one can quite agree whether it belongs to the cooper's son or a passing carter too embarrassed to claim it. Beside the lane stands a little roadside shrine, a painted saint under a peaked wooden roof, one hand lifted in blessing and the other nearly hidden by wax drippings and weather stains. Someone has tucked dried herbs there, and a bent pilgrim badge hangs from a nail. Some swear that if wool passes beneath a saint's eyes before market day, it sells more readily. Others say saints have better things to do than haggle over cloth. Even now, it is hard to tell whether people truly believe such things or simply dislike taking chances. You fetch a bundle of kindling from the lean-to and return inside, closing the door quickly behind you so the heat you have barely earned does not escape at once. The room has changed already. The fire is enough now to reveal more than shapes. The rushes on the floor are old and need changing. A little soot has drifted down near the hearthstone. The iron key to the chest glints by the pot. The dog from the lane, or perhaps another equally suspicious dog, has come to sit just beyond the threshold, scratching once and then huffing with the resigned air of one who expects no breakfast and plans to remain anyway. You set water to warm. Not much. Fuel is dear, and this is not a morning for luxuries. You pull yesterday's cloak tighter while the household begins to stir in earnest. Your mother, or your wife, or simply the older woman who has long since earned the right to give orders by saying fewer words than everyone else, rises from the bench bed and goes straight to the chest. Out comes a small loaf of coarse bread wrapped in cloth, hard at the edges. Out comes a pinch of salt, guarded like treasure. A little ale remains in the jug, thin enough that calling it hearty would be a theological stretch. This is breakfast in the season when nothing green grows fast enough and no one wastes a thing. You tear bread and chew while the warmth of the hearth reaches your knees. In the dimness, every object has its memory. The loom beam rubbed smooth by years of use, the wool blanket patched in 3 different shades, the bench scarred by knife cuts. A spindle dropped and cracked last autumn. Beeswax from a better candle saved in a chipped cup for feast days or sickness, while common tallow serves the rest of the year with its usual talent for smelling faintly like regret. Soon the first true task begins, though it is less a beginning than a return. A medieval weaver's day rarely announces itself with grandeur. It arrives as repetition. It asks for hands before thought, for habit before speech. You gather yesterday's prepared wool and inspect it in the growing light. It lies soft but uneven in places, still smelling faintly of lanolin, of rain, of the sheep from which it came months ago. This section of the labour is not yet the loom's dominion. It belongs to readiness to sorting, folding, checking, knowing what can wait and what cannot. Yet before your fingers fully commit, you attend to a dozen tiny matters that stitch the morning together. You shake ash from the hearth edge, you shift the pot, you glance at the roof where a damp stain has spread near one beam. You lift a basket to keep the mice from another easy feast. You rub your hands before the flame because cold fingers are clumsy fingers, and clumsy fingers mean wasted work later. In the corner, a child turns in sleep and kicks free of a blanket, and someone tucks it back without a word. The village outside grows audible in layers. First a cart axle crying somewhere beyond the lane, then a gate unlatching, then women's voices at the well, low and practical, then the thud of an oak door, then geese, as always, convinced that all events are about them. The priory bell fades, and in its place comes the ordinary music of people beginning again. You sit on the low stool near the loom, though not yet at it, and lay the wool across your lap. The fibres catch the weak light from the door. You think, not for the first time, How strange it is that so much of life depends on this humble softness. Wool warms the shepherd, the widow, the merchant, the child, the monk with ink-stained hands, the reeve riding out in rain, the manor lord pretending not to shiver in a stone hall. Wool hangs as blankets over bed frames, stuff seams against draughts, lines cloaks, pads saddles, wraps relics, and marks station even when it tries not to. Fine wool speaks one language, rough wool speaks another. A weaver learns both. Still, your part in it begins before anyone sees the finished cloth, before dye or sale or praise or complaint. It begins here in the half-dark, with smoke in the rafters and a heel of bread in your stomach, when the work is still only potential, and your body has not yet remembered how tired it will become by noon. There is something almost prayerful in that, though no one in the room would call it so. Monks get to have offices and psalms. You get draughty doorways and wool dust. Yet repetition is repetition, whether in a choir stall or before a loom. Those who tell the tale never fully agree about whether craftsmen are naturally patient or merely trapped into becoming so. Perhaps patience grows on you the way soot does, one layer at a time, until one day it seems part of the grain. Or perhaps patience is simply what people name the inability to run away before breakfast. You rise once more and step to the door, peering out at the paling east. The sky is turning from iron to pearl. Mist sits low over the fields, and the hedges are dark lines against it. Somewhere beyond them lies the road that leads to the market town, where cloth will someday be weighed, unfolded, pinched, judged, taxed, praised too faintly, and paid for too late. Beyond that stand abbey walls, manor courts, toll gates, storehouses, and all the larger machinery of the world. But none of that has arrived yet. What has arrived is this hour, and this room, and the certainty that your day belongs to the same motions that shaped yesterday. The suspicious dog has not moved. He watches you as though you owe him rent. You toss him a crust too small to count as generosity and too large to call accidental. He takes it with grave dignity. Some swear dogs lingering at a doorway before sunrise mean strangers will come by noon. Others say it only means dogs are excellent judges of where bread might appear. The second explanation feels safer, though not necessarily more comforting. When you return to the stool, the room is lighter by a breath. The fire is steady now. The older woman is muttering over the pot. Someone has risen to sweep yesterday's dirt from one side of the floor to the other, which is the medieval understanding of deep cleaning. The loom stands ready, and the wool waits in your lap like a promise you did not exactly make but must keep all the same. So the day begins not with fanfare but with settling. Your shoulders lower, your feet find their place on the rush-strewn floor, your hands close around the first small task. Outside, the village lifts itself into morning one creak at a time. Inside, the room warms by inches. The smell of smoke, wool, damp hay, and coarse bread folds around you like an old companion. Somewhere in the distance the bell sounds once more, softened now by mist and habit. You hear it, and do not hurry. There is no need. The work is already here. The wool in your lap is colder than it looks. It yields beneath your fingers. Yes, but only reluctantly at first, as though it still remembers the wind that once moved through it on the hillside. You sit closer to the hearth, turning slightly so the weak warmth can reach your hands, and begin the slow, careful work of sorting. This is not the part anyone praises. No one in the market ever leans over a finished bolt of cloth and says, "Ah, yes, this must have been very well sorted at dawn." And yet, if you rush this moment, the whole day pays for it later. You draw apart the fibres, testing them between finger and thumb, feeling for the hidden tangles and bits of burr that cling like stubborn thoughts. Some locks are longer, smoother, willing to be worked. Others are shorter, matted, inclined to resist, as if they would rather remain as they are and trouble you for it. You separate them into small piles, each with its own quiet destiny, even now. It is hard to tell whether wool behaves this way because of the sheep it came from, or because the world itself prefers to make simple things complicated. The room behind you hums with the softer rhythm of morning. The pot has begun to murmur, not quite boiling, not quite still. Someone stirs it with a wooden spoon that has outlived several winters and at least one careless apprentice. The smell of something thin but warm, perhaps pottage. Perhaps simply hope stretched to its limit rises gently into the air. The older woman keeps one eye on the pot and one on you, though she pretends not to. She knows, as all seasoned keepers of households do, that a weaver's patience can fray faster than his thread if the morning is not set right. You take up the carding combs next, their teeth worn but still sharp enough to do their quiet work. They rest comfortably in your hands, as though shaped by years of use into something more familiar than tools, closer to an extension of your own intent. You place a tuft of wool between them and draw one across the other, slowly at first, then with a steadier rhythm. The fibres begin to align, pulled into order from their earlier chaos. It is a small miracle, repeated so often that no one calls it miraculous anymore. The sound is soft, just a faint whispering scrape, like reeds brushing together at the edge of a stream. It blends with the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of voices outside. You fall into a pattern without noticing the exact moment it happens. Pull, lift, turn, pull, lift, turn. The repetition settles into your bones. It is not unpleasant, though it carries a certain weight, like a tune that has no end. Across the room, a child sits up, hair tangled into a shape that might once have been deliberate. They watch you for a while, chin resting on knees, eyes still thick with sleep. You nod to them, and they nod back with great seriousness, as though acknowledging a fellow labourer in some ancient and honourable craft. In truth, they will likely spend the morning chasing chickens or inventing reasons not to fetch water. Still, there is a moment there, brief and quiet, where both of you share the understanding that this is how the day is made, one small, repeated motion at a time. You pause to flex your fingers. Already they feel the work, this slight stiffness that comes from cold and effort combined. You bring them closer to the flame again, letting the heat seep into your joints. It is said in some villages that if a weaver's hands are warmed too quickly, the threads will twist out of spite later. No one can quite agree whether this is true or simply the sort of warning elders give to keep the young from wasting firewood. You choose a middle path warm enough to work, but not enough to tempt whatever unseen forces might be listening. The wool grows smoother under your care. Each pass of the comb draws it closer to readiness, until it lies in soft, even rolls that can be spun without complaint. You gather these carefully, laying them aside like small promises. There is satisfaction in this, though it is a quiet kind. Not the loud satisfaction of a feast or a fair day's coin, but something steadier, like the feeling of a door closing properly after it has long stuck on its hinges. Outside, the village has fully woken. You hear the clatter of a cart moving past, its wheels protesting every stone. A voice calls out, sharp with purpose, then softens into laughter. The dog at your door has decided you're not entirely useless, and has settled himself more comfortably. his tail thumping once against the wood. Somewhere, a hammer strikes iron in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the smith beginning his own long conversation with metal. You shift your position, drawing your legs beneath you for a moment, then stretching them out again. The rushes crackle softly under your boots. They should be changed soon, you think, though that thought has been visiting you for several mornings now without much result. There is always another task that insists on coming first. Even now, the loom waits, patient but expectant, like a creditor who knows exactly how much time you owe. You glance toward it, measuring the distance between where you sit and where the true labour of the day will begin. The loom is not unkind, but it is unyielding. Once you take your place there, the hours will move differently. They will stretch and compress in ways that only repetition can manage. For now, you remain here, in the gentler phase of preparation, where mistakes are smaller and the rhythm is yours to shape. The older woman sets a small bowl beside you without ceremony. Inside is a portion of the morning's thin fare, more water than substance, but warm enough to matter. You thank her with a nod, and she returns it with one that says, "Do not waste time talking when there is work to be done." You eat between motions, lifting the spoon with one hand while the other continues to guide the wool. It is not graceful, but grace is not required here. Efficiency, on the other hand, is treated with something close to reverence. As you work, your thoughts drift in that slow, meandering way they often do when your hands are occupied. You think of the sheep from which this wool came, scattered across hills now touched with frost. You think of the shearers who clipped it in warmer months, their blades flashing in the sun. You think of the merchants who will one day weigh the finished cloth, their fingers quick and their smiles quicker. Somewhere between those moments lies you, here in the half-light, coaxing order from softness. Some swear that every thread remembers the hands that shaped it, that cloth carries with it a quiet record of its making. Others dismiss this as the sort of notion that keeps idle minds entertained through long winters. Even now, it is hard to tell whether such ideas hold any truth. But as you draw the fibres into alignment, you cannot help but feel that something of you settles into them, your patience, your weariness, your small, stubborn determination to see the task through. The pile of prepared wool grows steadily. It is not large, not impressive, but it is enough to begin the next stage, enough to keep the loom from accusing you of neglect. You set down the combs for a moment and stretch your back, feeling the gentle protest of muscles that have already done more than they would prefer. This is the nature of the work. It begins before you are ready and continues long after you would choose to stop. The light at the door has shifted again, brighter now, though still softened by the lingering mist. It touches the edges of the loom, the rim of the pot, the curve of the dog's back. It finds its way into the wool, making it glow faintly, as though it holds some quiet warmth of its own. You take a breath, deep and steady, and let it out slowly. There is no grand signal that tells you it is time to move on. No bell rings specifically for you, no voice calls your name. The decision comes quietly, as most important decisions do here. You gather the prepared wool, set aside the combs, and turn your body toward the loom at last. The day is no longer beginning, it has begun. You turn toward the distaff and spindle with the prepared wool gathered in your arms, and the room seems to narrow itself around this next, patient task. The fire at your side gives a little more heat now, though not enough to make anyone extravagant with gratitude. The morning has brightened, but only modestly. in that cautious way common to cold seasons and poor windows. Light slips through the shutter cracks and settles over the floor in pale bars, catching on dust motes, on drifting wool fibres, on the faint sheen of use worn into the wood of your stool. The loom waits nearby, but not yet. First there must be thread. Cloth may get the praise, but thread is what keeps the whole ambition from collapsing into a pile of sheep and disappointment. You set the wool beside you and draw the distaff close. It leans against your shoulder like something between a tool and a companion, familiar enough that your hand finds the right place on it without looking. The spindle rests in your palm, modest and smooth, a thing too simple to impress anyone and too necessary to ignore. There are households in which spinning is done almost constantly, the work slipping into every pause between larger duties, every stretch of waiting by the hearth, every hour when weather keeps people indoors and hands refuse to stay idle. Some swear a good spinner can tell the state of a household by the sound of its spindle alone, whether the home is orderly, anxious, prosperous, or one gust away from becoming a problem for someone else. You tease out the first length of wool and begin. The motion is small, almost delicate. One hand draws fibres loose, the other turns the spindle, and the twist begins to take hold. What moments ago was only softened, fleece becomes line, tension, purpose. You draw, turn, release, wind. Draw, turn, release, wind. It is the sort of rhythm that feels slight at first and endless soon after. The spindle dips, spins, steadies. The thread lengthens. The twist travels upward through your fingers with a peculiar liveliness, as though the wool has suddenly decided it would rather be one thing than many. This part of the day has its own quiet authority. Carding asks for attention, but spinning asks for calm. If your hands grow impatient, the thread thickens where it should narrow, thins where it should hold, snaps where it ought to endure. You cannot bully wool into becoming thread any more than you can argue mud into drying faster. Medieval life offers many lessons in humility, and most of them arrive before noon. Behind you, the household settles into its own routines. The pottage pot is stirred again. Someone shakes a blanket by the doorway. The suspicious dog has now become a permanent feature of the threshold, curled against the wood with the confidence of one who has annexed the property by sheer persistence. Every so often he lifts his head as if to inspect your progress, then lowers it again, apparently satisfied that the spindle has not disgraced itself. You keep your eyes mostly on your hands. The fibres pull through your fingers with that faint resistance that tells you they are behaving, more or less. The thread begins thick, then steadies as your grip remembers what sleep briefly stole from it. Your fingertips grow faintly sticky with lanolin left in the wool. It softens the skin a little, though not enough to count as kindness. There are women who rub herbs into their hands in winter to keep the cracks from opening. There are men who laugh at such habits until their knuckles split and bleed into their work. No one can quite agree whether goose-fat rosemary or a whispered charm to semblé works best against raw hands, but most people are willing to try all three if the season turns harsh enough. The spindle grows heavier as thread wins onto it. You lift it, set it spinning again, and feel the tug of the twist travel up through the line. There is a sort of magic in that, humble and mechanical and no less wondrous for being understood. A monk might spend his morning copying saints' lives in careful ink strokes. You spend yours making thread in a room that smells of smoke, wool, and thin ale. Yet both labours depend on steadiness, and both can be ruined by a wandering hand. The village beyond the door is fully awake now. A cart rattles past, less distant than before. From the lane comes the splash of someone missing the driest path and stepping straight into the rut anyway. A hen complains. Then another joins in, perhaps from solidarity, perhaps because complaint is contagious. Somewhere farther off, near the little roadside shrine, you hear two voices in dispute about whether the miller has kept back more grain than custom allows. Such arguments begin as softly as prayer and end with the enthusiasm of a tavern brawl, though usually with less ale and more pointing. You spin through it all. The rhythm protects you from the noise without entirely shutting it out. In that way, spinning resembles dozing in church. You remain present enough to avoid scandal, but not so present that every word lays claim to you. Now and then the thread thickens where your draw falters. You pinch it gently, coaxing the fibres into better order. Once, it narrows too much and snaps with a small, insulting pop. You stop, stare at the broken ends, and sigh in the old, familiar way of every craftsperson who's been personally offended by material. The older woman across the room glances up, not because the break matters greatly, but because the silence after it is too eloquent to ignore. "You pulled too proud," she says. That is all. No lecture, no ceremony, just a judgment delivered with the ease of someone who has spent years being correct in irritatingly compact phrases. You rejoin the ends and begin again, a little more humble, which is to say, a little more accurate. Some swear knots in thread are unlucky, especially if hidden deep in cloth meant for weddings, christenings, or burial wrappings. Others say a single knot, if made while thinking kindly of the wearer, guards against envy and the evil eye. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, which is convenient, because medieval people enjoy believing several contradictory things at once, as long as none of them require giving up a habit. You, for your part, try to keep knots out because buyers complain, not because spirits do. Still, when you smooth the joined thread between your fingers, you do so with a touch more care than reason strictly demands. The spindle turns, the thread lengthens, morning slips forward. It is easy, in work like this, to lose your place in time. Not entirely. You're never so fortunate as to forget there are hours ahead, but spinning makes the minutes less jagged. The priory bell sounds again from the rise, softer now, under the ordinary clatter of the village, and you realize a fair stretch of the morning has gone by. The half-burned candle by the chest remains unlit, waiting for evening. Light now is free, though mean with it. The wet wool smell has settled into the room like another presence. You can feel it on your sleeves, in your hair, along the back of your throat. A child comes near and watches the spindle in fascination. "Can I?" "No." This exchange, brief and traditional, satisfies both of you. The child hovers anyway. Children are to spinning what crows are to seedbeds curious, persistent, and only occasionally welcome. To distract them, you hand over a loose tuft of combed wool and tell them to keep it clean. They accept this commission with grave ceremony and immediately begin making it into something that resembles a saint's beard or a dead mouse. Both are equally plausible outcomes. You keep working. The thread you're making today is not for finery. No court lady will hold this cloth to the light and praise its softness. No merchant from a far city will haggle theatrically over its weave, as though doing you the honour of pretending it is beneath him. This thread is for durable cloth, useful cloth, the kind that lines common lives and outlasts polite admiration. It will become a kirtle, perhaps, or a hood, or winter wrappings, or a length sold to someone who will cut and stitch it without ever thinking of your cold hands in this room. There is a strange comfort in that anonymity. The cloth will go on living where you cannot. You pause long enough to wet your fingers at your lips, just slightly, to tame a flyaway wisp. Then you resume. The spindle dips and rises like a small obedient planet in orbit around your patients. Each fresh length is wound on, building quietly toward enough. Enough is a powerful word here. Not abundance, not luxury. Enough thread to warp the loom properly. Enough to keep the day from slipping into waste. Enough to answer the expectation waiting in that timber frame by the wall. Outside, the mist has thinned. Through the doorway you can see the lane more clearly now, the broken cartwheel still where it leans by the ditch as if hoping neglect will turn into repair. A man passes with a bundle over one shoulder and a fur-lined cap pulled low. He glances toward the house, then toward the dog, then carries on. Perhaps deciding there is nothing here worth stopping for. Fair judgment. Perhaps. Yet lives like yours are built from what people pass by. Not every labour announces itself with sparks or bells. The older woman hums under her breath while tearing bread for the child. The tune might be a hymn or a harvest song, or simply the same 4 notes every tired person eventually invents to keep silence from growing too large. Smoke gathers in the rafters, turning the upper air blue-grey. Your feet are no longer numb, only cool. This counts as progress. Somewhere in the course of the morning, the work stops feeling like something you are doing and becomes the condition in which you exist. You're not a person spinning for a while. You're a spinner, and this is the shape of the hour. Your shoulders settle. Your breathing matches the turn of the spindle. Even the small ache beginning at the base of your neck becomes part of the pattern, no more remarkable than the creak of the stool beneath you. Then, at last, there is enough of it wound on a useful quantity of thread, though not yet all you will need before the loom can truly take over the day. You lift the spindle and inspect it in the better light. The thread looks serviceable, steady for the most part, with only the occasional thickening that a forgiving eye might overlook. Since most eyes are not forgiving, you note those places anyway. A weaver learns quickly that cloth is judged by people who never helped make it. Still, it is good work, honest work, morning work. You set the spindle aside with care and rub your thumb against the groove it has pressed into your finger. The mark will fade by evening and return tomorrow, like so many things in this life. The distaff leans away from you now, lighter than before. The loom, by contrast, seems to draw a little closer in the room, not truly moving, of course, but gaining presence. Its hour approaches. For a moment you let yourself be still. You listen to the village, to the fire, to the dog sighing at the threshold, to the faint echo of the priory bell lingering somewhere above the fields. The thread rests wound and waiting, the wool smell, the soot-black rafters, the rushes underfoot, the thin daylight, the familiar room, everything holds together in a kind of rough harmony. Then you gather the spun thread into place and prepare to leave the spindle behind, because the morning is advancing and the next labour is waiting with wooden patience. By the time you set the spindle aside, the room has changed from dawn's grey reluctance to the clearer, flatter light of morning. It is not bright, exactly. Brightness belongs to feast days, to summer fields, to saints painted in manuscripts with more gold leaf than sense. What reaches your house now is a steadier sort of light, enough to show the grain in the oak boards, the worn polish on the stool legs, the ash scattered near the hearth, and the faint drift of wool fibres still floating in the air like pale little ghosts that have not yet decided whether to settle. The fire has done its best. It gives warmth in patches, as medieval comforts often do, and the pot hanging above it sends up a humble steam that smells of oats, onion, and whatever generosity the larder could spare. This is the hour when hunger returns, not dramatically, but with the calm confidence of something that knows it will be accommodated. You've been awake long enough for the first crust to vanish into memory, long enough for your hands to earn a pause, and long enough for the household to begin moving around one another with that practiced morning choreography that needs no discussion. A bowl is set out, bread is cut. The child who is recently entrusted with a tuft of wool and the dignity of responsibility has somehow turned both into a mild inconvenience. The older woman rescues the wool with a look that suggests civilization itself hangs by a thread. You shift closer to the hearth and settle on the bench. The wood is smooth in places where generations have sat, polished less by care than by repetition. A piece of coarse bread is placed in your hand, dark and dense, with a crust stout enough to remind you that mills and ovens do not exist for your amusement. You dip it into the pottage, and the steam rises against your face, carrying the scent of onion, a little cabbage, and perhaps a whisper of yesterday's barley, if there is meat in it. It has chosen a life of contemplation and remains difficult to detect. Still, it is warm, and warmth counts for more than luxury here. You eat slowly, partly because the food is hot, partly because there is no advantage in swallowing the whole of breakfast too quickly. Thin ale is poured into a cup and passed to you. It is weak enough that no one need fear scandal before noon, but it has body enough to soften the bread and settle the stomach. Water alone is not always trusted, and with reason. Some swear ale, even poor ale, keeps off fevers better than any prayer muttered over a bucket. Others say that is merely what brewers tell people so they can remain employed. No one can quite agree whether the saints approve of breakfast ale, but given the weather and the quality of village wells, they may be willing to look the other way. The suspicious dog, who's taken up permanent station by the door, receives a crust not quite large enough to flatter him and not quite small enough to insult him. He accepts it with the grave dignity of a minor nobleman receiving rents in kind. His ears twitch at every sound from the lane, though he does not rise. You begin to suspect he may now consider himself part of the household. Medieval life is full of such quiet annexations. Around you, breakfast is less a meal than a brief harbour. The child eats with the concentration of someone prepared to defend every bite. The older woman takes her portion standing up, because sitting suggests leisure, and leisure is a rumour most working people hear about but seldom meet. A younger voice from the doorway mentions that the baker's wife was seen before sunrise, carrying 2 loaves and muttering, which can mean only one of 3 things: a feast day, a funeral, or neighbours. In a village like this, all 3 draw equal scrutiny. You tear another piece of bread and listen. Morning talk arrives in fragments, never in neat narratives. Someone mentions that the Reeve rode past yesterday toward the Manor Court. Someone else says market tolls may rise again in town because the bridge planks are failing. Someone adds that a peddler came through last week with cheap pins, saffron of suspicious brightness, and a relic said to be a splinter from the manger at Bethlehem. Though those who tell the tale never fully agree whether it was truly holy wood or simply part of a very ambitious stool. You chew and let the talk wash over you. This is how the world reaches houses like yours, in scraps, in rumours, in half-believed complaints exchanged over pottage. The fire cracks softly. You hold your hands toward it and feel the heat return to your fingers, which remain faintly scented with lanolin from the wool. It clings to you even through breakfast, a reminder that the day is only pausing, never stopping. On the beam above the hearth hangs a bunch of drying herbs, yarrow, perhaps, and thyme, and something bitter no one willingly uses unless obliged by illness. Folk cures gather in houses the way soot gathers in rafters gradually, inevitably, and with very little agreement about what truly works. Some swear a charm tied with a red thread above the bed keeps away bad dreams and fevers alike. Others trust leeches, or onion poultices, or a priest with a steady hand over the holy water. You have lived long enough among all these remedies to know that confidence is often the most active ingredient. Your gaze wanders toward the folded cloth stacked in the oak chest, toward the wool blanket patched and repatched, toward the little hoard of ordinary things that make a household hold together. A weaver notices cloth everywhere. You cannot help it. The cuff fraying on a sleeve, the corner of a sack giving way, the way wool hangs differently when tightly fulled or loosely woven, the difference between a garment made for warmth and one made for being seen, even at breakfast. Your eye weighs thread counts the way other men weigh turnips. It is not exactly romantic, but then neither is most of medieval life. The romance is usually added later by people who never had to scrub soot from a cooking pot. Someone asks whether you heard the bell at dawn, and you nod. Of course you did. The priory bells have a way of threading themselves through everything: the first cold step onto the floor, the splash of icy water, the crackle of kindling, the turn of the spindle. Bells mark hours for those who can read the sky and those who cannot, for monks in cloisters and for villagers with muddy boots. They come down through the mist and over the fields as if time itself belongs to the church and is being lent out in cautious portions. You suspect this may even be true. The bowl in your hands warms your palms, and for a moment the whole room seems to gather inward. The draught at the door eases. The child has stopped fidgeting. Even the dog sighs and lowers his head. Outside, the village continues its small clatter cartwheels. Geese. A distant call near the well, but in here there is a pause soft enough to notice. It is not silence. Medieval houses are never truly silent. There is always a spoon against pottery, a stool scraping stone, a hen objecting to something beyond human understanding. But there is a hush of attention, as though everyone is borrowing a little steadiness before the next labour takes them. You remember, as people often do over simple food, the strange beliefs that travel with ordinary things. There are villages where women leave the first crumbs of a loaf near the hearth for household spirits, though the priest says sternly that no Christian hearth should entertain such nonsense. There are old men who refuse to cut cloth on certain saints' days for fear the garments will bring misfortune. There are mothers who tuck bits of blessed wool into cradles against the evil eye. Some swear that cloth woven while quarrelling always sits badly on the shoulders. Others say the cloth is fine, it is only the marriage that sags. Quiet little superstitions cling to daily life like burrs to fleece irritating, persistent, and oddly difficult to discard entirely. You finish the pottage slowly enough to scrape the bowl with your bread. Waste is a sin everyone believes in, no matter what else they doubt. The ale is nearly gone. You swallow the last of it and set the cup down near the hearthstone, where a dark ring among older dark rings marks the table's long history of practical use. Across from you, the older woman is already back at her tasks, because breakfast ends not when comfort is satisfied, but when duty reasserts itself, which, in this age, is usually sooner than anyone prefers. Your shoulders have loosened a little in the warmth, but not enough to trick you into false hope. The loom still waits, the spun thread still rests wound and ready. The morning has matured into that hour when dawdling begins to resemble irresponsibility. You can feel the next stage of the day gathering itself, not dramatically, but with the same quiet inevitability as weather rolling over a winter field. Before you rise, your thoughts drift for a moment toward the wider village. Somewhere the baker is drawing loaves from the oven with reddened hands. Somewhere a monk with ink-stained fingers bends over a page while wax hardens beside him. Somewhere a widow mends a cloak near a shutter too warped to close properly. Somewhere smoked fish is being unwrapped. Market tolls are being cursed, and an iron key is turning in the lock of a winter storehouse. Everyone is fastening themselves to the day in their own way. Yours simply happens to involve thread, timber, and the endless patience of woven things. You brush crumbs from your lap. A few fall into the rushes and disappear there among older crumbs, older ash, and the general archaeology of ordinary living. The child eyes the last piece of bread, and you surrender it with a generosity made easier by the certainty that you will soon be too occupied to miss it. The dog gets up at last, circles once near the doorway, and lies down again as though satisfied breakfast has been conducted to proper standards. When you stand, your knees remind you they have not forgiven the stool, the spinning, or the cold morning floor. You stretch your back. The room no longer feels like a refuge so much as a workshop again. The bowl is taken from your hand. The spoon is wiped. The fire settles lower but steadier. Light reaches farther across the floor now, touching the loom beam and the bench beside it. There is no ceremony in this transition. There never is. A pause ends. A task resumes. Life goes on by means of such plain, unspectacular bridges. You take one last moment near the hearth, warming your palms, carrying the taste of coarse bread and weak ale with you, and then you turn toward the loom with breakfast behind you and the day's real labour gathering ahead. You leave the hearth with a little warmth still caught in your hands and cross the room toward the loom, which has been waiting all morning with the unblinking patience of a thing that knows it will have its due. In the clearer light, it seems larger than before, not because it has changed, but because now you are ready to stand before it properly. The timber frame rises solid and plain from the rush-strewn floor, worn smooth where hands have touched it most often, rougher where no one ever bothers. It smells faintly of old wood, wool dust, and the dry, almost papery scent of thread that has lived too long indoors. This is the heart of your day, the place where all the earlier small labours sorting, carding, spinning, warming stiff fingers over a modest fire must now justify themselves. You stand there a moment without moving, not from idleness, but from habit. A weaver learns to begin by looking. The spun thread must be checked. The warp must lie true. The heddles must not have twisted in the night as if offended by neglect. The shuttle must be where you left it and not, as sometimes happens in houses where children and cats ignore propriety alike, somewhere improbable and deeply inconvenient. Your gaze travels over each piece, and the loom answers you in its own language. Tautness here, order there, one slight looseness that will want correcting before it becomes a nuisance with ambitions. You set the spun thread within reach and begin the small preparations that let the larger rhythm take hold. Nothing about this is dramatic. It is exacting. Yes, but not grand. You touch the warp threads one by one, testing their tension with your fingertips. A good line offers resistance without sulking. Too loose, and the cloth will wander. Too tight, and something will snap purely to make a point. Medieval tools are a little like medieval officials in that way they function best when respected and become tiresome when either neglected or forced. The room narrows around the work. Behind you, the household continues in its softer ways, the older woman rinsing the bowl, the child inventing some unnecessary game with a stick and a bit of wool, the suspicious dog giving one brief snort in his sleep, but their sounds begin to recede. The loom has a way of gathering attention until all else becomes background, not gone, merely farther away. You settle onto the bench and place your feet. Your body already knows this posture. Your shoulders lower. Your knees angle into place. Your hands rest for one breath on the beam before beginning, as if greeting an old companion you do not especially like but cannot do without. Then you draw the first pass. The shuttle slips through the shed with a neat wooden whisper, and the sound is so familiar that it feels less like hearing and more like recognition. You catch it, draw the beater forward, and the thread settles into line with a soft, satisfying firmness. Not a thud, not a strike, but a measured setting down, as though each pass of the weft is being persuaded into belonging. Then again, shuttle through, catch, beat, again. The rhythm arrives quickly and with more authority than spinning ever had. Spinning is a quiet conversation. Weaving is a pact. Soon the loom begins to speak in its full voice, the creak of timber under small strain, the tap of wood against wood, the hushed drag of thread finding its place. These sounds will accompany the rest of the morning and much of the afternoon, settling so deeply into your ears that even later, lying beneath a wool blanket in darkness, you will still hear them lingering somewhere just behind thought. The clatter is never wild, but it is steady, and steadiness is what makes it powerful. The first inches of cloth emerge almost shyly, plain and tight, no more than a narrow declaration that the work is real. You watch them with the practical satisfaction of someone who knows beginnings are rarely beautiful but must be sound. This will not be the sort of fabric that travels to a noble hall and gets admired by candlelight while someone with rings on every finger calls it tasteful. This is working cloth, honest cloth, village cloth, meant for use rather than praise. It will warm backs, wrap shoulders, line hoods, patch sleeves, perhaps cover a bench in winter or become a child's winter tunic by the time all its earlier duties are done. There is dignity in that, though it is seldom dressed in poetry. You fall deeper into the motion, lift, pass, catch, beat, change, lift, pass, catch, beat. The sequence becomes so natural that your thoughts begin to drift within it, not away from the work, but alongside it. This is one of the quiet peculiarities of weaving. Your hands remain exact while your mind wanders like a monk in a cloister walk. You think of the bell from dawn, of the broken cart wheel still leaning by the ditch, of the shrine by the lane where someone left dried herbs and a bent pilgrim badge. You think, too, of the market town beyond the fields, where a merchant will one day pinch this cloth between two fingers and pretend the work of your whole body has become a flaw he has generously noticed. You smile at that, though only slightly. Dry humour is one of the cheaper comforts available to working people, and so naturally you make good use of it. The loom keeps its pace. Your feet and hands coordinate themselves so completely that it almost feels as though the machine is remembering through you rather than the other way around. Shoulders forward, shuttle through, beater down, breath, again. The plainness of the cloth is part of its difficulty. Fine patterns sometimes forgive the eye with their cleverness. Plain weave offers nowhere to hide. Every inconsistency sits there in honest daylight, visible to anyone who cares to squint. No one can quite agree whether simple cloth is easier or harder to make well. Those who speak least about it usually understand best. As the work continues, your body begins to register its cost, not sharply at first, a small tightening between the shoulder blades, a hint of ache in the wrists, the neck reminding you that it exists and resents being overlooked. The bench is not cruel, but it is firm in the old medieval way, which is to say it believes comfort builds weakness and therefore need not be encouraged. You shift once, settle again, and continue. There is no point in making a ceremony of ordinary discomfort. If every stiff muscle received proper attention out here, nothing would ever get done. Sunlight, such as it is, moves slowly across the floorboards. It catches the iron key near the chest, the rim of the pot, the edge of the half-burned candle you saved for evening. Dust drifts in it. So do tiny filaments of wool, invisible until the light finds them. The room smells of smoke and old timber and wet wool drying by degrees. This smell has worked itself into everything: the cloak hanging by the door, the blanket folded by the wall, the very grain of the loom. If paradise has a scent, it is probably not this one, but this one, at least, is yours. At some point the child wanders near enough to watch again, lulled perhaps by the rhythm or merely curious to see whether the shuttle might do something reckless. It only goes where you send it, you murmur. The child nods solemnly as though this is profound truth, which perhaps it is. Then they ask if cloth can remember the hands that made it. You glance at the growing strip on the loom. Some swear it does. This satisfies them more than certainty would have. Children and villagers alike are often fondest of answers that leave room for legend. They drift away again, perhaps to bother the dog, who endures these interruptions with the patience of a saint painted on a church wall and the enthusiasm of a sack of onions. You keep weaving. Hours like this are built of repetition, but repetition is never entirely empty. The warp threads shimmer faintly when the light catches them. The shuttle warms in your hand. The beater's wooden edge has the same worn smoothness as a prayer rail. Somewhere beyond the door, the village continues its ordinary disputes and errands. A woman laughs. A man curses softly at something with wheels. Geese object to existence. A distant hammer answers with iron certainty. Yet all of it arrives softened by the loom's steady voice, as if your work is laying a layer of cloth not only across thread, but across sound itself. There are old sayings about weaving, as there are about everything. Some swear that beginning a warp on a Friday invites breakage, especially if the moon is thin. Others say a thread crossed by moonlight becomes stronger, provided no jealous person watches it. There are weavers who tuck a saint's medal near the beam, and others who mutter that skill is better than relics, though even they often leave the medal there all the same. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether misfortune comes from poor timing, bad luck, or simple carelessness. You suspect carelessness does the most damage, but you're not above a little caution where unseen forces are concerned. Medieval life rarely rewards overconfidence. The cloth grows, inch by inch, line by line. It advances with a patience that borders on mockery. You can labour for an hour and feel, when you pause to look, that the loom has rewarded you with something only slightly larger than a generous scarf. Yet there it is, firm, even useful. You run your fingers briefly over the woven surface and feel the compact ridges of each pass. The texture is plain, but plain things endure. Your shoulders ache more clearly now. The same motions, once almost soothing, have become authoritative in their demand. This is what the outline of your life is made of: repeated movements turning slowly into wear. Not dramatic ruin, just the gradual shaping of body to labour. The village carpenter bears it in his back, the baker in his arms, the monk in his eyes, the shepherd in his knees. You bear it here, in the shoulders and wrists, and the small knot settling low at the base of your neck like an unwelcome tenant. So you pause not long enough to count as idleness, only long enough to roll your shoulders once and stretch your fingers. You hear the room again, the fire sighing, the dog scratching in his sleep, the older woman humming half a tune while folding a blanket. The pause is brief but precious. Then you place your hands back on the loom, and the rhythm resumes almost at once, as though it had merely been waiting with one eyebrow raised. Lift, pass, catch, beat. The day does not rush, it accumulates. That is the way with weaving and with most worthwhile things in this age. Nothing appears by miracle. It comes by repeated obedience to small motions. Another line, another. The cloth extends. Your breath settles into the pace of it. Even your thoughts begin to thin out, growing quieter, more thread-like, until there is only the loom, the work, the smell of wet wool, the soft light, the old room, and the deep calm that sometimes rises from doing one thing steadily enough for the rest of the world to loosen its hold. By the time you next glance toward the door, morning has edged nearer to noon than to dawn. The mist is long gone from the lane. The broken cartwheel still leans where it was, a faithful monument to unfinished intentions. The dog opens one eye, sees that nothing exciting has happened, and closes it again. You almost envy him, but not quite, because here, beneath your hands, the cloth is taking shape, and with it that quiet, stubborn satisfaction only repetitive labour can give the sense that the day, however slow and plain, is being made into something you can touch. The rhythm holds you longer than you expect. At some quiet point between one pass of the shuttle and the next, you realise you have stopped noticing the effort and begun simply existing within it. The loom no longer feels like something you are working against, or even with it feels like a condition, like the cold in winter or the hum of insects in summer fields. It surrounds you. It settles into your bones. Lift, pass, catch, beat. The motions continue, but they no longer ask for permission. The cloth grows, though never quickly enough to impress anyone with a taste for spectacle. It inches forward with the patience of stone walls rising one block at a time, or monks copying pages no one outside their cloister will ever read. You draw the beater forward again and again, and each time it answers with that same quiet firmness, setting the thread into place as though sealing a promise that must not be broken. You begin to notice the small irregularities that only a weaver ever sees. Here, a thread sits just slightly tighter than its neighbour, pulling the line into a faint suggestion of curve. There, a tiny thickening where the spindle betrayed you earlier and forced a repair. You smooth them as best you can, coaxing the cloth toward honesty rather than perfection. No one can quite agree whether perfection is even desirable in handmade things. Some swear a flaw left deliberately in the weave keeps pride from angering heaven. Others say that is simply a comforting story told by those who made a mistake and could not fix it. You suspect both explanations have been true at different times. The light has shifted again. It comes more directly through the doorway now, reaching deeper into the room and laying itself across the loom like a pale cloth of its own. It catches the fine dust drifting in the air, each mote moving slowly as though reluctant to settle anywhere permanent. The smell of damp wool has softened slightly, replaced by something drier, warmer, though the smoke in the rafters remains as constant as a stubborn thought. Your shoulders protest more openly now. The ache is no longer a suggestion but a companion, sitting firmly at the edge of your awareness. You adjust your posture, roll one shoulder, then the other, and continue. There is no great remedy for this, only small accommodations, a shift of weight, a deeper breath, a moment's stretch when the rhythm allows it. Some swear that rubbing the joints with warmed goose fat keeps the pain from settling in too deeply. Others insist that only prayer and endurance have any lasting effect. Even now, it is hard to tell which method is more reliable, though goose fat has the advantage of being immediately available. The child has disappeared. likely drawn away by something more exciting than watching thread behave itself. The older woman moves quietly through her own tasks, her presence steady but unobtrusive, like a well-built wall that does not need to announce its strength. The dog remains at the threshold, though he has shifted his position so that one paw lies inside the doorway, as if testing whether the household will object to further expansion of his territory. Outside, the village has reached that part of the day where activity becomes less urgent and more settled. The early rush has passed. Now there is a steadier flow of movement, someone carrying a basket toward the well, another leading a stubborn goat along the lane, a pair of voices discussing something that sounds important but will likely be forgotten by evening. From farther off comes the faint echo of hammer on metal, slower now, as though even the smith has accepted that not all work must be done at once. You keep weaving. The repetition begins to take on a different quality. It is no longer simply the absence of change, but a kind of quiet presence. Each motion follows the last so naturally that time seems to stretch and thin, like wool drawn into thread. Minutes lose their edges. You could have been sitting here for an hour or a lifetime. The difference feels less important than it once did. Your thoughts drift again, but more slowly now, as though weighed down by the rhythm. You think of the patterns you could weave if time and thread allowed for more than necessity. Subtle changes in colour, small variations in texture, designs that might catch the eye of someone who has the leisure to look closely. But such thoughts pass quickly. Plain cloth is what is needed. Plain cloth is what will be made. There is a certain peace in that, even if it lacks the charm of ambition, somewhere in the back of your mind. You remember a story told by a passing traveller, something about a distant town where weavers work together in large halls, their looms arranged in long rows, the sound of them filling the air like a storm that never quite breaks. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether such places are marvels of efficiency or prisons of noise. You try to imagine it the constant clatter, the closeness of so many workers, the absence of this quiet space, and find yourself uncertain whether it would be an improvement. There is comfort, after all, in the familiar creak of your own loom, in the way the room holds the sound without overwhelming it. The cloth advances. You pause briefly to check the tension again, running your fingers along the warp threads, feeling for any sign of trouble. They hold firm, for now. You nod to yourself, a small acknowledgement that things are proceeding as they should. In a life where so much depends on forces beyond your control, weather, harvests, the mood of a lord or a market, there is something deeply satisfying about a task that responds directly to your care. You resume the rhythm. Lift, pass, catch, beat. Your breathing has matched it now, rising and falling in quiet agreement. Even your heartbeat seems to settle into the pattern, though perhaps that is only your imagination seeking order where it can. The world beyond the loom feels distant, not gone, but softened, as though seen through a thin veil of wool. At some point, you realize the ache in your shoulders has become a steady warmth, no longer sharp, but persistent. It is the kind of sensation that will linger long after the work is done, a reminder of effort that cannot be easily set aside. You accept it without much thought. There are few alternatives. The light shifts again, just slightly, and you know without looking that the day is moving toward its middle. The shadows have shortened. The air feels less biting. Somewhere, a bell may soon ring again, marking the hour in that calm, indifferent way bells have. You've heard it so often that you no longer need to listen for it. It exists whether you attend to it or not. You glance down at the cloth. It has grown more than you expected. Not dramatically, not in a way that would surprise anyone else. but enough that you can feel the progress in your hands. The surface is even, the lines steady, the small imperfections few enough to pass without comment. It is good work. Not perfect, not remarkable, but good. And in this life, good is often the highest praise that can be relied upon. You run your fingers over it once more, then return to the motion. The loom answers you as it always does, with steady sound and patient resistance. It does not hurry you, it does not slow you. It simply continues, as it has for years, as it will for years more, long after this particular morning has been folded into memory like so many others. Outside, the village continues its quiet business. Inside, the room holds its warmth. The dog shifts again, perhaps dreaming of something more interesting than a doorway. The older woman hums, barely audible now, and you, seated at the loom, continue to weave, one thread at a time, into a day that is both entirely ordinary and, in its own quiet way, complete. By the time you finally let the shuttle rest in your hand for more than a breath, the day has reached that plain, unsentimental middle where hunger returns and the village begins to sound less like waking and more like enduring. The light outside is thin but steadier now, stripped of dawn's softness and not yet warmed by any true generosity. It lies over the lane, the fence posts, the broken cart wheel by the ditch, and the little roadside shrine with its weathered saint. All of it looking equally worn and equally necessary. You sit back from the loom and feel the shape of your own body return to you, shoulders stiff, wrists warm, neck tight with the faithful complaints of repeated labour. The cloth beneath your hand has advanced enough to prove the morning was real. That is satisfaction enough for now. You rise slowly, because the bench has made a temporary argument with your spine and prefers not to part on friendly terms. The dog at the threshold opens one eye as if to note this development for some private household record, then decides you're still not interesting enough to stand for. You cross to the door, duck beneath the lintel, and step into the village lane with a smell of smoke and wet wool still clinging to your clothes. The air outdoors feels wider, even when it is cold. It carries mud, wood smoke, damp straw, and the faint sour tang of the ditch where water never quite drains properly. Your boots sink a little at the edges of the cart ruts, though the middle path is packed hard enough by use to spare you the worst of it. Nearby, a woman shakes crumbs from a cloth into the yard for chickens that arrive with all the solemn urgency of bishops attending a dispute over land. A boy runs past with a stick and no visible purpose, which is to say he is perfectly occupied. From farther up the lane comes the scrape of a cart being unloaded and the complaint of someone who has discovered, too late, that barrels remain heavy even when one resents them. This is the hour when the village shows itself most plainly. Morning's first bustle is settled into habit. Doors stand open where they can. Smoke rises more steadily from chimneys. A bench has been dragged into a patch of weak sun by someone determined to call it comfort. And everywhere, in one form or another, there is cloth, a hood drying on a fence rail, a sleeve being patched by a doorway, a wool blanket aired over a line, a market sack tied, untied, retied again. Cloth hangs between people and weather, between household and poverty, between ordinary life and naked inconvenience. You notice it all automatically. A weaver always does. Other men see tools, livestock, mud. You see seams, hems, fraying edges, and whether a weave was tight enough to outlast a second winter. You make your way toward the centre of the village, where the lane widens a little near the well, and the common space beyond it opens toward the road to town. It is not a market day here, not properly. but there are always traces of trade in places where roads meet needs. A peddler's cart might linger, a farmer might swap onions for lamp oil. A woman with eggs may pause long enough to discuss prices she dislikes and neighbours she distrusts, often in the same tone. Today there are 2 small stalls set up under patched awnings, one with coarse salt and onions, the other with iron bits, pins, and a handful of ribbon too faded to flatter anyone but still not cheap enough to dismiss. You slow there, more from curiosity than intent. The man with the iron goods knows you by sight and lifts 2 fingers in greeting without interrupting his complaint to another customer about road tolls. Market tolls are among the few subjects guaranteed to sour a peasant, a peddler, and a merchant all at once, which makes them one of the village's rare unifying institutions. He says the bridge near the town has taken damage again, and now the collectors mutter about repairs as if every loose plank were your personal moral failing. Some swear the toll-keeper counts badly on purpose. Others insist he counts perfectly and merely enjoys the expression on people's faces. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, though everyone is certain the coin leaves their purse faster than is decent. You drift on, letting talk gather around you in fragments. 2 women near the well are discussing dyed cloth from the town, one insisting a deep blue hood is proof of vanity, the other replying that vanity is only a sin when poorer people manage it. A thin old man with a pilgrim badge pinned crooked on his cap claims he once saw a Flemish broadcloth so smooth it folded like water. No one believes him completely, but no one is rude enough to say so while he's still standing there. Some swear foreign cloth is finer because northern sheep graze on blessed grass. Others say foreigners simply charge more and let imagination finish the weaving. Even now, it is hard to tell whether people envy distant goods or merely enjoy talking about them. At the edge of the widening lane, a cart from the manor lands has stopped to have one wheel checked. You know the servant beside it, one of the steward's men, narrow-faced, practical, with the kind of expression that suggests he's been born mildly disappointed. He's carrying sacks and folded lengths of something rough, perhaps linen, perhaps undyed wool, and he glances at you with that quick measuring look common to anyone who deals in household needs. Cloth is never simply cloth where manners are concerned. It becomes rents, obligations, liveries, bedding, wrappings, altar hangings, and endless accounts written by someone else. He nods, still weaving. The question is so plain it nearly becomes a joke. No, you say dryly, I've taken up falconry. He gives you a look that says he suspects mockery but cannot spare enough energy to chase it. That is the mercy of midday. Everyone is too tired to be offended properly. He asks whether you may have a plain length ready before the next week's end. Something serviceable. No fancy dye. For household use. Household use means it will be underpaid and urgently wanted. You tell him perhaps, which is not agreement, but not refusal either. In a village like this, trade often begins as mutual pessimism. He mutters about the steward, about shortages, about the lady's maid insisting on mended hangings before winter. Damp gets worse. Then he lowers his voice to mention that the manor court may ask again after cloth dues in the coming month. This is how trouble enters common life, not with trumpets, but the tired servant in muddy shoes passing on news no one invited. You nod, because nodding is cheaper than argument, and because there is little to be done before such things ripen into actual demands. When he moves on, you remain in the lane a little longer, watching the everyday exchange of goods and rumours. A basket of leeks changes hands. 2 smoked fish are examined as though they were reliquaries of uncertain holiness. A girl with a ribbon she clearly cannot afford stares at it long enough to make the peddler hopeful and her mother dangerous. Nearby, A widow unfolds a worn sleeve to compare its cloth against a scrap offered for patching. You see at once that the fibres will not marry well. A poor repair lasts half as long and gets twice the blame. There is always something faintly exposing about stepping out among other people after hours alone with the loom. Indoors, the day narrows into thread and wood and repetition. Out here, you are reminded that every yard of cloth must eventually leave the room and enter a world of bargaining, need, pride, weather, and hands less careful than yours. The village does not care how meditative the weaving felt. It wants warmth that lasts, cloth that does not unravel, and prices that do not insult the hungry. The bell from the priory sounds again, thinner at this distance, and for a moment the talk at the well softens as if everyone hears it whether they mean to or not. Time passes differently in villages that can hear monastery bells. Even those who rarely pray end up living by the discipline of men behind walls. Somewhere up on the rise an ink-stained monk may be moving from one office to another, while you stand ankle-deep in ordinary mud considering the price of thread. The contrast is not lost on you. Still, both lives are ruled by repetition. Only one has better candles. You turn at last toward home, though not directly. On the way back you pause by the roadside shrine. The saint's painted face has faded so much that his expression could be mercy, sternness, or simple weather damage. Beneath him lie a few dried herbs, a bead, and a strip of cloth tied to a nail. Someone has asked for healing, or luck, or safe travel, or perhaps relief from a cow that refuses to calve. People ask for everything at shrines. Some swear a strip of weaver's thread left there before market day protects a cloth from mildew and envy alike. Others say mildew fears only sun and dry air, and envy fears nothing at all. You do not leave a thread, but you do pause longer than reason requires. Medieval people are practical right up until they are frightened, and then suddenly everyone becomes a poet of small rituals. When you step back into your yard, the house looks as it did before and not quite as it did. A few more shadows have shifted, a little more smoke drift from the roof. The dog, having briefly followed you halfway down the lane and then reconsidered his commitment, reappears from nowhere and resumes his station near the doorway as if he's been guarding the place in your absence from robbers, wolves, or worse, unpaid relatives. Inside, the room closes around you again with its familiar scent: smoke, wool, old wood, damp rushes. The loom waits where you left it, patient and mildly accusatory. The cloth on it is still plain. The thread beside it is still needed, and for all the noise and trade outside, this is where the day truly belongs to you. You rest your hand once more on the beam, feeling the smoothness worn there by years of labour, and gather the afternoon around you like another layer of cloth. You settle back onto the bench with the village still faintly clinging to you, the sound of the well, the smell of damp lanes, the steward's man with his practical face and inconvenient reminders, and for a moment the house seems smaller than it did before you stepped out. Not cramped, exactly, simply gathered in. The doorway narrows the world again. The rafters lower it. The loom takes hold of it. Outside there are carts, tolls, shrines, ribbons no one should buy, and rumours moving on every breath. In here there is wood, thread, wool, and the long obedience of the hands. The weather changes while you're sitting down. Not dramatically. Medieval weather rarely bothers with theatrical gestures unless crops are involved. But you hear it first as a soft thickening on the roof, a patter that begins so lightly it could almost be mice in the thatch, then steadies into rain. The sound spreads across the house in little variations on roof boards, along the edge of the shutter, in the yard where it darkens the earth and presses the loose straw flat. A draught moves through the room, cooler than before, carrying that unmistakable smell of wet ground lifting itself back into the air. The older woman glances toward the door and says only, "Good." That is all. Rain means soft lanes, leaking roofs, and extra complaints. It also means you're less likely to be pulled into some outdoor nuisance before evening. A weaver's heart is not always noble. Sometimes it is simply relieved when weather gives him an excuse to remain where the thread already expects him. You touch the cloth on the loom and feel that it has cooled while you were away. The thread seems a shade more brittle in the damp, or perhaps you are imagining it because rain makes everyone suspicious of their materials. Some swear wool behaves better in moist air. Less prone to wild static, more willing to settle. Others insist dampness invites every mischief short of open rebellion. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. But every craftsperson in the village suddenly becomes a philosopher when the weather shifts. You begin again. Lift, pass, catch, beat. The rhythm returns more slowly this time, as if the room must remember it along with you. The first few passes feel stiff, your shoulders not yet persuaded back into their earlier discipline. But the loom is patient in its stern way. It accepts no drama, only continuation. Soon the shuttle is moving neatly through the shed again, and the beater comes forward with its familiar measured firmness. Outside the rain gathers itself into a steadier fall, and the sound lays a second rhythm over the first water above, weaving below, two forms of repetition sharing the afternoon without speaking. Rain changes the light more than the dark. The doorway remains open only a crack now, enough to watch the yard silver over in places, enough to see the dog pull himself reluctantly farther under the eaves with the offended expression of one betrayed by the sky. The pale daylight that earlier reached all the way across the floor now turns flatter, dimmer, more diffuse. It softens the edges of things. The loom becomes all lines and shadow. The chest by the wall recedes. The half-burned candle looks suddenly more relevant, though not yet necessary. The smoke in the rafters hangs lower, as if the damp air has persuaded it not to rise any farther than duty requires. You keep weaving. The room smells different now. Wet wool has returned to prominence, though not because anything is soaked. Rather, the air has remembered sheep and hillside and every long damp season that came before. The cloak by the door releases a faint scent of old rain. The rushes underfoot take on a softened, earthy smell, and the timber frame of the house seems to breathe it all back out. If cities are built from stone and argument, village houses are built from dampness and persistence. The work settles over you again, though in a heavier way than before. Morning weaving had a certain clean, awakening steadiness. This afternoon carries weight. The rain hushes the village beyond the walls, and with less distraction the monotony becomes clearer. Lift, pass, catch, beat, lift, pass, catch, beat. The cloth grows, but so slowly that the mind begins measuring progress against aches rather than inches. This is the true secret of repetitive labour. It is not merely dull, nor merely soothing, it is both, and sometimes both at once. Your back reminds you of itself. Your wrists do the same. The bench remains unwavering in its conviction that comfort is a sin best avoided. You shift, then continue. A few strands of wool cling to your sleeve. Your fingers, warm now, move with more certainty than they did at dawn, but they are also more tired, and tired hands must be watched carefully. A good weaver knows that errors often arrive not when you are hurried, but when you are dulled. The older woman moves behind you with the quiet economy of someone who has no spare gestures. She checks the pot, folds a cloth, adds a bit of wood to the hearth, and at one point pauses by the doorway to judge the rain, as if personally acquainted with its habits. She mutters that the lane will be a swamp by vespers, and that the Reeves horse deserves it. This seems a complete thought and requires no answer. Outside, the village sounds change beneath the rain. Cartwheels vanish, voices shorten, doors close more often. Somewhere nearby, a child shrieks with the joy of having found a puddle large enough to offend an adult. A woman calls sharply after them. A hen, denied whatever dignity it once imagined for itself, complains beneath a cart. The bell from the priory arrives muted through wet air, not gone, only blurred, as if even holy time has had to wrap itself in wool. You glance down at the growing cloth and see a place where the line has thickened slightly. Not enough to ruin anything, but enough to catch your eye and nettle your pride. You stop, press it gently, adjust the tension with careful fingers, and resume. There is a particular weariness that comes from correcting small errors in a task no one else believes difficult. People think weaving is merely sitting. Those people should be made to sit properly for 6 hours and then explain themselves. The rain continues, steady now, and you begin to understand why old people sometimes speak of weather as if it were a neighbour with moods. It changes not only the road or field, but the pace of thought indoors. Under rain, even the loom sounds different, softer at the edges, less assertive, as though the house itself is padded by the weather. The shuttle's whisper is gentler, the beater's contact is less sharp in the ear. Every sound finds cloth and damp air waiting to catch it. You drift into thought without quite leaving the work. You think of the manor servant asking after plain length of cloth. You think of market tolls and bridge planks and how every finished piece must pass through hands eager to value it lower than it deserves. You think, too, of those finer fabrics spoken of in the lane-dyed blues, distant broadcloth, goods praised precisely because they come from elsewhere. There is something mildly insulting in the way people admire what travelled farther, as though a cloth becomes nobler for having suffered more road dust. And yet, plain cloth has its own authority. It is the cloth of everyday endurance. It takes smoke, mud, grease, rain, winter skin, children's hands, old shoulders, patched elbows, and long service. It becomes lining, wrapping, blanket, hood. It survives generations not because anyone treasured it, but because no one could manage without it. There is a kind of glory in usefulness, though it wears no bright dye. Some swear that if rain falls while a loom is working, the cloth will keep out weather better when worn. Others say that is nonsense invented by people too poor to wait for clear skies. Even now, it is hard to tell whether the belief comforts you because it is plausible or because you simply want the weather to mean something kind. Medieval life trains people to read signs into everything bird calls, candle sputters, dreams, the way dough rises, the sudden cracking of a thread. When certainty is scarce, significance becomes a local craft. Your shoulders tighten again. You pause only long enough to press your fist lightly into the small knot at the base of your neck. It helps very little, but doing nothing would feel like surrender, and people of your station rarely indulge in gestures that resemble surrender. Then you place your hands back where they belong and go on. The afternoon deepens. The doorway dims further. The dog, now resigned to weather and existence alike, sleeps with his nose under his tail. The child returns briefly, wet at the hem and carrying a leaf as if it were a treasure from Jerusalem. The older woman wipes mud from the little shoes with a cloth that has already done too much in its life. No one makes a speech about it. Medieval affection often hides inside scolding, drying, feeding, and making room near the hearth. The loom carries you forward one line at a time. At moments the repetition feels nearly peaceful, like listening to rain from beneath a heavy blanket. At others it becomes so monotonous you begin to suspect the universe itself may secretly be made of nothing but repeated patterns and damp wool. Both impressions seem equally possible. Then the house gives a small groan. Not from the loom, from above. A beam settling, perhaps, or the roof taking the weight of water where it prefers not to. You look up automatically. The older woman looks up too. Both of you wait. A drop falls near the wall, darkening the packed earth beside the chest. Then another. Not a leak. Not properly. More a reminder that the roof and the weather are in an ongoing negotiation neither side has fully won. Put the bucket there later, she says. Of course. There's always a bucket for something. For water, grain, ash, scraps, leaks, hope. Civilization, you sometimes suspect, is merely the correct placement of buckets. You smile faintly and continue. The rain does not stop. The cloth does not finish. The light does not improve. And yet the afternoon holds. The lines remain straight. The thread behaves well enough. Your hands, though tired, still obey. There is a quiet kind of victory in that. Not triumph, not relief, only continuation without collapse. By the time you pause again to look, the woven length has advanced farther than you thought. The monotony hides progress while it is happening. That, too, is one of labour's old tricks. Day after day it persuades you that nothing is changing, then suddenly offers proof to the contrary in the form of finished cloth, worn hands, and seasons that have somehow moved on. You run your fingers once along the woven surface, feeling the tight plainness of it, the steadiness under the small irregularities, the simple truth of work done properly. Outside, rain moves over the village roofs and lanes. Inside, the loom waits for the next pass with wooden patience. So you draw a breath, settle your shoulders again, and let the repetitive hush of the wet afternoon close around you like another layer of wool. The rain lingers long enough to lose any sense of novelty. It is simply there now, woven into the afternoon the way smoke is woven into rafters or wool dust into your sleeves. It drums lightly on the roof, gathers in the yard, and turns the lane outside into a patient smear of mud that no one with sense crosses unless they must. Inside, the house has accepted its dampened, dimmer mood. The bucket has been placed beneath the small drip near the wall. The child has been persuaded, by means both verbal and maternal, to remain nearer the hearth. The suspicious dog sleeps under the eaves with the deep surrender of a creature who has decided weather is a personal insult but not worth getting up about. And you remain at the loom. By now the rhythm has settled so deeply into your body that it feels less like work than a condition of existence. Your hands know what to do before thought arrives. Your feet shift as they must. Your shoulders ache in familiar places. The plain cloth grows inch by inch, stubborn and useful. This, perhaps, is the most truthful shape of a weaver's life, not a grand performance of skill, but a long agreement with repetition, maintained despite weather, stiffness, hunger, noise, and the occasional desire to fling the shuttle into the yard and take up a profession involving less sitting and more applause. Then, because the day enjoys proving a point, the thread snaps. It is not dramatic. Nothing explodes. No one gasps. There's only that small, sharp break in the texture of the work, a dry little pop, almost delicate, followed by a looseness where there should be tension. Yet the effect is immediate. The rhythm collapses. The shuttle stops in your hand, your shoulders, halfway through the motion, tense in a way that feels both ridiculous and sincere. A single broken thread, and suddenly the whole afternoon seems to lean sideways. You stare at it. The broken end curls back faintly, insolent as a child pretending not to hear. You find the other end and hold both between finger and thumb. There is no mystery here. Damp air, long use, slight unevenness from the spinning, repeated strain across hours of weaving. Any one of these could be enough, or all of them together. Some swear thread breaks when a jealous eye has lingered too long on the work. Others say it breaks when people speak proudly of cloth before it is finished. Still others, generally the wiser sort, say thread breaks because thread is thread and the world does not owe you smooth progress. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, but the repair is always the same. You lean closer, narrowing the world to that single failure. There is a particular irritation reserved for small setbacks in repetitive work. Great disasters at least grant a person the drama of complaint. Small ones merely demand patience you have already spent. You wet your fingers lightly and twist the ends together, joining them carefully, trying to keep the place as neat as possible. A visible knot is an offence. An invisible repair is a victory so modest no one praises it, which makes it perfectly suited to your station in life. Behind you, the older woman notices the pause without turning. Broke. Yes. A moment passes. Then mend it. This is not unkindness. It is simply the household's philosophy in 3 words. You almost admire it. There is clean efficiency to living among people who refuse to romanticize inconvenience. You return your attention to the cloth. The repair must be made properly or the flaw will travel through everything after it. A tiny weakness hidden in plain sight. You work the broken thread back into place, guiding it with your fingertips, checking the neighboring lines, making sure the tension will hold when the loom begins again. The effort is minute, exacting, and profoundly unspectacular. Yet this is where a day's labour is often won or lost, not in the grand visible sections, but in the quiet refusal to let a small break become a larger one. Rain ticks softly into the bucket by the wall, the fire shifts. The child, sensing that adult frustration is in the room but not yet directed anywhere specific, stays wisely silent. The loom waits. At last you test the line, it holds. You draw a slow breath and resume. Lift, pass, catch, beat. The first few motions after a break are always suspicious. You do not trust the repaired thread. The repaired thread does not trust you. Both of you proceed with politeness and doubt. The shuttle moves through. The beater comes forward. Nothing gives. Again. Still nothing. Slowly the rhythm rebuilds itself, not with the easy flow of earlier, but with a cautious, almost ceremonial return, like guests re-entering a hall after someone has dropped a jug at supper. You keep your eye on the repaired place longer than necessary. It passes beneath your hands, line after line, still visible to you though likely no one else would notice. That is another feature of craftsmanship. You never stop seeing the flaw you prevented from becoming worse. The world receives the finished cloth and thinks it whole. You remember exactly where it nearly ceased to be. The afternoon grows heavier in the room. The rain eases a little on the roof, then returns. Light fades by degrees, turning from pale to dull to the sort of grey that makes every object appear to have surrendered a little. The doorway shows only a wet yard and a darkened strip of lane beyond. Somewhere outside, a cart passes very slowly, wheels dragging through mud with the mournful sound of timber regretting its choices. The priory bell rings again, softened by the weather, and for a moment the whole house seems to listen, the drip into the bucket, the hiss near the hearth, the tiny movements of the child, even your own hands pausing half a breath before continuing. Lift, pass, catch, beat. The work resumes its place in the world, and with it comes the strange calm of accepted monotony. Yet the break has changed something in you, if only slightly. You're more alert now. Your hands test the thread with greater care. Your eyes move more often over the warp. You notice a place where the fibres look a touch thinner, another where the line sits just slightly proud of its neighbours. Nothing serious, nothing yet. But now the cloth seems less like an obedient result and more like a thing requiring negotiation. This, perhaps, is the truer nature of labour than any song about cheerful industry. Work is not a simple triumph of effort over matter. It is a constant treaty with materials that fray, soften, harden, split, warp, and sulk according to rules only partly visible. Wool shrinks when it chooses, stretches when it should not, catches burrs from fields you've never seen, and carries the habits of sheep long after the sheep themselves have become stew, memory, or someone else's concern. Wood swells in damp weather, linen creases, leather cracks, iron rusts, thread breaks, and people, in the midst of all this, are expected to maintain standards. You almost laugh, not bitterly, just with that quiet internal amusement that comes from recognizing how much of civilization depends on small repairs made by tired people. Castles may rise, abbeys may ring bells, manor courts may issue judgments, relics may glitter in candlelight, but somewhere beneath it all, someone is always rejoining a broken thread and trying not to swear. The child edges closer again, curiosity stronger than caution. Did it break badly? There are worse ways for things to go wrong. This seems to satisfy them, though only because they have never had to meet a merchant who pinches cloth between two fingers and makes a face as if your whole day was woven incorrectly out of spite. They peer at the loom, looking for evidence of catastrophe, and when none appears, they lose interest. Disaster, to the young, is only impressive when visible. You continue. The repaired section passes out of immediate sight and becomes part of the growing cloth, folded into usefulness like every other compromise. Your hands regain some confidence. Your shoulders settle once more into their resigned ache. The bench remains exactly as unforgiving as before. The bucket catches another drop, then another. Somewhere a hen complains from under a cart or bush, or whatever shelter hens believe they have chosen rather than merely stumbled into. The room smells of rain, wet wood, old smoke, and wool warming near the body as you work. It is an intimate smell, not pleasant in any refined sense, but deeply familiar, the kind of smell that enters clothing, curtains, blankets, and memory alike. A life can be recognized by its odours as much as by its deeds. Yours, on days like this, could be described entirely in smoke, lanolin, damp rushes, onion pottage, and cold iron. Some swear that when thread breaks during rain, the finished cloth keeps luck out with the weather. Others say bad luck travels happily through any seam it finds. Even now, it is hard to tell whether these sayings were born from observation or simply from people needing the world to feel interpretable. You understand the impulse. Repetitive work gives a person too much room to think, and thinking too long in a damp room can make philosophers out of anyone. At length, another small trouble appears, not a break this time, but a place where the weft catches badly and draws tighter than it should. Pulling the edge inward, you stop again, less irritated now, more matter of fact. This is the tone of the latter afternoon, not outrage, just correction. You ease the line, loosen the drawer, and settle it properly. The cloth obeys. It often does, once firmly but calmly reminded. A repair here, an adjustment there, a check of tension, a resumed pass. The monotony remains, but it is no longer empty. It is populated by these small acts of vigilance, the hidden maintenance without which nothing durable would ever exist. And perhaps that is what most people fail to understand when they imagine craft as a sequence of picturesque motions. The beauty, if it exists, lies not only in rhythm, but in the refusal to let a flaw remain, to let carelessness spread, to let a broken line become a ruined piece. By the time you lean back and look again, the cloth has advanced farther than seems fair. Hours of work have been interrupted, mended, adjusted, resumed, and still the woven length has grown. That is one of the slyest comforts in repetitive labour. Even trouble, if managed properly, moves forward. Outside, the rain finally begins to thin. Not stop, exactly, but lighten into a finer patter, less insistent than before. The yard is dark and wet. The lane will be worse by evening. The broken cart wheel by the ditch, if you were to look, would now be shining with water like some relic of failed intention. Inside, the room remains dim, enclosed, almost monastic in its hush. The loom stands before you, no kinder and no crueler than it was at dawn. Your hands rest briefly on the beam. The repaired thread holds where it should. So you let yourself sit with that small success for one quiet breath before reaching once more for the shuttle, because the day is not finished, and neither, despite everything, is the cloth. The rain has not truly ended, but it has withdrawn into something quieter, a fine and uncertain drizzle that hangs in the late afternoon like a thought not yet fully spoken. The roof still murmurs now and then, and the yard remains dark with wet, but the harsher drumming has softened. In its place comes a different kind of hush, the sort that arrives when weather tires itself out and people begin venturing back into the world one cautious errand at a time. You hear it first as a gate creaking somewhere along the lane, then as footsteps in mud, then as a voice calling to another across the wet air, low and practical, as if no one wishes to wake whatever spirit of rain may still be lingering above the village. Inside, the room holds the last shape of the afternoon. The bucket near the wall catches only the occasional drop now. The fire has settled lower, though the older woman feeds it another piece of wood with the stern look of one who suspects winter is always listening. The child, wearied by weather and confinement, has gone quiet near the hearth with a scrap of cloth and a stick, inventing some silent kingdom where both are of urgent importance. The suspicious dog has returned fully to the doorway and sits there with damp dignity, as if guarding the threshold from puddles, saints, or tax collectors. You're still at the loom when the first knock comes. It is not loud, just 2 measured raps on the doorframe, followed by a pause that suggests the visitor has not come for gossip alone. You stop with the shuttle halfway through a pass and sit very still for a moment, listening. In villages like this, visitors at certain hours mean one of 3 things need: obligation or trouble dressed politely. Sometimes all 3 arrive together. The older woman glances up. See who it is? Of course, houses like yours do not employ stewards of the threshold. You set the shuttle down, rise with the stiffness appropriate to the hour, and cross the room. The dog, feeling suddenly official, stands and gives one restrained bark, then another, as if to establish that he has allowed this interruption only under protest. When you open the door, The lane gives you back 2 figures and a damp gust of evening air. One is a neighbour woman from farther down the lane, wrapped in a cloak that has done its best against the weather and lost gracefully. Her hem is muddy, her cheeks are pink with cold. In one hand she holds a folded bundle under linen, tucked close to keep it dry. Beside her stands a peddler you've seen before, though not often in weather, this poor narrow-faced bearded, with a hood darkened by drizzle, and a pack that looks heavier than his cheerful expression admits. A man like that carries needles, ribbon, combs, thread of doubtful origin, bits of brass, saints in pewter, and rumours in greater quantity than all the rest combined. The neighbour inclines her head. I hoped you might look at something. That, at least, is better than the steward sent me or there's been an accident, both of which would have worsened the hour immediately. You step aside to let them in. The peddler ducks under the lintel with the air of a man accustomed to entering houses where smoke, dogs, and scepticism all arrive before welcome. He nods to the older woman, nods to the child, eyes the loom, and then gives you a brief glance that carries the usual travelling merchant mixture of calculation and charm. He has already taken measure of the room, the quality of the cloth on your beam, the state of your firewood, and perhaps the likelihood of being offered something warm. Peddlers have a way of inventorying a household in the time it takes other men to remove a wet cap. The neighbour unwraps the bundle. Inside lies a garment plain wool, dark once but much faded, with one seam opened badly under the arm and another near the side beginning to give way. It is the sort of damage common to hard use and narrow margins. Cloth lives a rough life in villages. It is scrubbed, wrung, slept in, worked in, patched, repatched, passed down, cut apart, turned, and somehow expected to remain respectable. The miracle is not that seams fail, it is that they ever hold at all. She lays it across the bench. I wondered whether there is enough of your plain weave to mend this proper, she says, before colder weather sets in worse. You run your fingers along the torn seam, then over the cloth itself. It is worn thin in places, thick in others, a history of repairs written by several hands of differing skill and optimism. The weave is not yours, coarser, older, but close enough that a careful patch would sit without too much insult. You glance toward the loom, toward the growing length of plain cloth, and back again. There will be enough soon, you say. Soon is a flexible word in craft, but it has the advantage of sounding helpful while preserving your dignity. The peddler, naturally, chooses this moment to involve himself. I may have thread that would suit, he says, already lowering his pack to the floor with the subtle inevitability of rain finding a leak. Of course he does. Peddlers can smell opportunity through 2 doors and a fog bank. He opens the pack with neat practised motions and begins producing a small travelling world, skeins of thread, packets of pins, a strip of narrow ribbon in red gone slightly weary with time, a few pewter badges, combs, 2 wooden spoons, a charm against A's in a little linen twist, and a tiny tin saint whose face has been worn by touch into an expression halfway between serenity and administrative disappointment. The child is instantly fascinated. The older woman is instantly wary. Both reactions are correct. You crouch to inspect the thread. Some is good. Some is merely ambitious. A practised eye sees the difference at once. The peddler notices your notice and smiles the smile of a man who has often priced goods according to weather, urgency, and whether the buyer looks sleep-deprived. Not the dyed skein, you say, touching one roll and setting it aside. Too fine, it will show. He lifts his brows as if mildly impressed, though not enough to lower the price out of admiration. Then the undyed. Not that one either. Twist is uneven. Now he is properly impressed and slightly annoyed, which is the healthiest arrangement between merchant and craftsman. The neighbour waits patiently while the two of you conduct this damp little fencing match over thread. She has come for a practical end and has no desire to watch men perform ancient rituals of mutual underestimation. Still, she listens. Everyone listens when trade is happening, because trade is theatre with consequences. At last you select a modest skein, not excellent, but sound enough for mending and not so dear as to become offensive. The peddler names a price that suggests either great confidence or a recent head injury. You answer with one that suggests he may yet need the saint in his pack more than the sale. Between the two lies the truth, muddy and unavoidable. He sighs. You sigh. The older woman makes a small noise from near the hearth, a sound too restrained to be called a snort and too expressive to be mistaken for anything else. Some swear haggling is dishonourable. These are generally people who have never been poor or have forgotten the experience in suspicious detail. Out here, bargaining is not greed, it is weatherproofing for the purse. The price settles at last, along with one packet of pins the older woman claims she did not want and somehow acquires anyway. The peddler wraps the thread carefully. The neighbour gathers her worn garment and asks, more quietly now, whether you think the seam will hold through winter if properly mended. You consider the cloth in your hands. Worn fabric makes promises reluctantly. It will hold better than it does now, you say, which is not poetic but is true. She nods, satisfied enough with honesty to prefer it over comfort. That is another village habit. People will accept a hard answer if it sounds as though it came from real use rather than performance. The peddler, seeing practical business concluded, tries his luck with conversation. He mentions the road toward town, the bridge still troublesome, a wagon stuck axle deep beyond the low field, and a rumour that a new toll may be imposed come Martinmas if the manor pushes its claim. He says there is also, farther south, talk of dyed cloth from the coast reaching market in uncommon shades this year, greens deep as marsh reeds, a reddish-brown like horse-chestnut bark, and one blue so rich it made half the stalls look ashamed of themselves. No one can quite agree whether such colours come from skill, expensive mordants, or cheerful lies told by merchants. The peddler, being a merchant of sorts himself, defends the profession by shrugging and saying that lies, like dyes, take best when fixed properly. You almost laugh at that. He also produces, briefly, a little charm tied with red thread and dried herbs, claiming some women hang such things near the loom to keep breakage away. The older woman gives him a look so cool it could preserve fish. We have enough things hanging here already, she says. That is the end of the charm. Still, you note the red thread. There are villages where it would indeed find a place by the beam, not because anyone fully trusts it, but because thread is fragile and fear makes room for many guests. Some swear Saint Blaise watches over wool workers. Others leave a sliver of blessed candle wax near the loom on certain feast days, even now. It is hard to tell whether these customs spring from devotion, habit, or the simple human wish to feel accompanied in repetitive labour. Perhaps all three. The neighbour stays only long enough to warm her hands at the fire before stepping back into the lane. The peddler follows, pack buckled shut again, lighter by a skein and perhaps heavier with village opinion. At the door he pauses and glances once more at your loom. Plain weave, he says, but even. There are compliments more elaborate than that, but not many more useful. When they are gone, the room closes around you again. The drizzle outside makes the lane shine dull silver. The dog resettles at the threshold with the authority of one resuming a watch interrupted by inferior personnel. The child asks whether peddlers sleep in ditches. The older woman replies that they sleep wherever people are foolish enough to buy ribbon in bad weather. This sounds like wisdom, though perhaps only because it comes with such certainty. You return to the looms slowly, carrying with you the faint after scent of wet cloaks, road mud, merchant leather, and outside air. The visit has broken the monotony without quite dispelling it. If anything, the cloth before you seems more rooted now in the village beyond the walls. It is not merely thread crossing thread. It is a future seam in a neighbour's garment, a patch against cold, an answer to some small household need, the manor servant's request, the neighbour's torn sleeve. Pins on a peddler's cloth, wet hems in the lane, all of it folds back into this room. You sit, you place your feet, you rest your hand once more on the worn beam. Then you begin again, while outside the fading weather and the slowly darkening village gather themselves toward evening. By the time the door has closed on the peddler and the neighbour, the room feels altered in that subtle way all small houses do after visitors leave. The air carries a trace of wet wool and road mud not entirely its own. The bench has been disturbed. The dog has rearranged his dignity. Even the loom, though unchanged, seems to wait with a little more patience than before, as if it knows the day has entered that quieter, softer stretch, where labour does not cease so much as lower its voice. You return to the bench and work a little longer, enough to steady the rhythm again, enough to add a few more lines while the light is still serviceable. But afternoon is slipping, the grey beyond the doorway has deepened, the drizzle lingers in the yard and beads along the fence rail. The cloth on the loom remains plain and sound, but now your hands begin to think not only of weaving, but of what must follow. Plain weave may clothe the world, yet even humble cloth sometimes asks for colour, or at least for tending in warm water, herbs, and steam. The day is turning toward that gentler, slower labour. At last you stop. Not because the cloth is finished. Cloth is rarely finished when one wishes it to be. But because the light has softened enough that careful work on the loom risks becoming careless work, and there is no honour in pretending otherwise. You sit back, rub your wrists, and look toward the hearth, where a second pot now hangs lower over the fire. It has been set there quietly while you worked, and a bundle of leaves and roots lies near it on the board dried weld. Perhaps, or a little madder. Onion skins saved from meals past, and a twist of something darker, whose exact identity depends on whether the older woman is naming it by household habit, herbal use, or local superstition. The room shifts from loom work to hearth work almost without ceremony. You rise and bring over a folded length of cloth, not the one still on the beam, but a smaller woven piece that has waited its turn for colour and finishing. It is plain wool, tightly made, meant for ordinary use, but even ordinary use benefits from care. A little colour lifts a garment above bare necessity, a warm brown, a faded yellow. A red softened almost to rust. Such shades do not make a peasant noble, but they do make winter less determined to erase him. Some swear colour changes a person's mood more than it changes their station. Others say it changes neither, but still prefer not to dress like old oatmeal if given the choice. The pot begins to breathe steam. You kneel by the hearth and feed the fire a little, not too much. Dying asks for heat. Yes, but not a wild boil that bullies the cloth or wastes the precious matter of plant and water. There is an art to moderation here, as in most medieval tasks. Too little heat and the colour sulks. Too much and the cloth suffers. The liquid clouds. The room fills with a smell even the dog finds morally objectionable. Soon the first scents rise. Wet wool, of course. Then the sharper green earth smell of crushed plant stems, then something faintly bitter, resinous, almost sweet underneath. Steam gathers under the rafters and softens the room's edges, blurring wood, wall, and hanging cloak into a warmer haze. In summer, such steam would be oppressive. In this damp evening it feels almost kind, a change from the clean grey chill beyond the door. You lower the cloth carefully into the pot and use a wooden stick to press it beneath the surface. It darkens at once, taking on that strange submerged heaviness familiar to all textiles in water, less like a garment now than a creature gone still. The liquid shifts around it in slow turns. You stir gently. Colour takes time to persuade. No one can quite agree whether cloth receives dye better when spoken to softly, worked in silence, or left under the protection of a saint's name. Some women mutter a blessing over the pot. Others refuse to let envy look directly at a fresh dye bath. You yourself trust timing more than charms, but not so completely that you would mock the charms aloud. The older woman comes near, holding a little cloth pouch of mordant and salts, and tips some in with the practised economy of one who has judged such quantities by eye for years. She does not measure. Medieval households measure by memory, by hand, by the phrase enough, which is either wonderfully efficient or the reason half the world is forever redoing things. Still, you've learned that her enough is usually correct. The child creeps closer too, drawn by the steam and changing colour, though warned 3 times not to touch the pot and therefore more interested than ever. You let them hold one end of the stirring stick for a moment. This creates the impression of involvement without inviting catastrophe, a valuable household technique. Outside, evening begins to gather itself. You cannot see the priory on the rise from here, but the bell reaches you all the same, muffled through damp air and timber. It sounds farther away than it did at dawn, though perhaps that is only because the room now feels more enclosed. Smoke and steam and failing light make their own walls. The dog has moved fully indoors at last, surrendering his post at the threshold to common sense, and lies with his chin on his paws watching the pot as if he suspects supper may have become more interesting than usual. You lift part of the cloth with the stick to inspect it. The colour is only beginning to hold, uneven still, like twilight arriving over fields. You lower it again. Dyeing teaches patience of a different sort than weaving. Weaving obeys motion. Dye obeys waiting. It seeps, fixes, deepens, chooses. It asks less of the wrists and more of restraint. You stir once more and settle on the stool nearby, letting the steam reach your face. This is one of the quietest hours in a working house. The day's harsh edges have begun to dull. The loom stands at rest, darkening in the corner. The fire gives off a more companionable heat. Even the room's familiar smells, soot, wool, damp rushes, old timber seem gentler when mingled with herbs and hot water. A person could almost mistake it for comfort if comfort had not been so careful all day to keep expectations modest. You think of colours you've seen in the wider world, though only in glimpses. A merchant's trimmed hood dyed deeper than village means allow. A church hanging with red so rich it looked almost wet in candlelight. A lord's sleeve lined in blue that must have crossed half a country to get there. Most people here live among browns, greys, creams, dull reds, smoke-dark greens. Yet even these quieter colours matter. They carry season, habit, trade, and hope. A woman may save for years for a dyed kerchief. A mother may put a brighter edge on a child's hood as if colour itself were a form of blessing. Cloth, after all, meets the eye before it meets the weather. Some swear yellow lifts melancholy from a winter house if hung near the bed. Others say red thread sewn into a hem keeps fevers from climbing higher into the body. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, but folk cures and folk colours often travel together. The same woman who recommends rosemary against headaches may also insist that green is unlucky in childbirth unless lined with blessed linen. Medieval certainty is a patchwork garment at the best of times. The steam thickens for a while, and droplets gather along one beam before falling softly to the packed earth. You stir again, slow and even. The cloth rolls beneath the surface like a quiet animal. The child has grown drowsy watching it and leans against the older woman's skirt. The dog sighs once. Somewhere outside a cart goes by at a crawl, wheels softened by mud. Then silence, except for the small sounds of the house, the pot, the fire, the settling timber, someone's breath. At length you draw the cloth partly out again. Now the colour has taken more fully, not bright, never bright enough to scandalise a priest, but warm, a muted gold brown touched by smoke and evening, useful colour, honest colour, the sort that survives village life without looking either vain or defeated. You hold it there while the steam runs off in thin streams, then lower it into a second vessel to rinse. The water clouds faintly. The cloth grows heavier in your hands, and you feel at once the satisfaction and the work remaining. Wet wool is no small burden. It resists lifting with the quiet force of something that has decided gravity deserves respect. You carry it to the board near the fire and press it carefully, then hang it where the warmth can reach it without scorching. Already it looks different in the dim room, catching what little light remains and returning it softly. A small change, perhaps. But small changes are the architecture of this life. The older woman nods approval, which in her language is nearly applause. You sit once more by the hearth, hands open to the warmth, face damp from steam, and watch the cloth begin its slow drying. The room glows now in firelight more than daylight. Shadows climb the walls. The half-burned candle near the chest may soon have its turn. The loom waits in darkness, patient as ever. The air smells of herbs, wet wool, wood smoke, and the faint mineral tang of hot water. It is a good evening smell, not festive, not rare, but full. For a little while no one speaks. There is no need. The day is moving of its own accord now, away from effort and toward reckoning. The cloth hangs newly coloured, the fire settles lower, outside, the village dims under a sky that has spent itself in rain, and you sit in the steam-softened hush, feeling the work of the day still in your shoulders, but the room around you turning, at last, toward night. The house grows darker by such small degrees that you scarcely notice the loss of daylight until firelight has already taken over the room. One moment the doorway still holds a flat grey suggestion of the yard, the wet fence rail, the lane beyond. The next, those things seem farther off, reduced to outlines and guesswork, while the hearth gathers authority and everything nearer to it begins to glow in warmer tones. The newly dyed cloth hangs where the heat can reach it, no longer dripping, only breathing out the last of its dampness into the rafters. It catches the firelight softly now, the muted gold brown deepening into something richer than it looked by day. Not rich in the noble sense, certainly. No baron's daughter would ruin her sleep envying it, but rich enough to please the eye of anyone acquainted with long winters and plain garments. You stay near the hearth a little while longer, hands stretched toward the warmth, wrists slack at last, shoulders still carrying the day in their deeper fibres. The older woman has begun clearing away the traces of the dye work with the same practical quiet that has governed every other labour since dawn. A pot is shifted. The stick is rinsed. The cloth pouch of salts and herbs is folded and put aside. The child, heavy with the drowsiness that follows indoor weather and evening heat. Sits on the floor near the dog and has stopped pretending not to yawn. Then, because one day's work is never permitted to be merely one day's work, the time comes for accounts. Not grand accounts, no steward's rolls, no abbey inventories, no legal Latin scratched by a clerk who smells faintly of ink and superiority. Yours are humbler, but no less consequential for that. Thread counted, cloth measured, favours remembered, coin estimated, future obligations peered at through candlelight like unwelcome guests approaching through fog. A household survives by such reckonings as much as by bread or firewood. The older woman nods toward the chest. Light the beeswax. That alone tells you the hour has turned serious. Tallow will do for eating, mending, even for brief evening tasks. But when figures matter, when cloth lengths must be judged honestly and coin spoken of without confusion, beeswax earns its place. You rise, cross to the chest, and take up the half-burned candle saved from better evenings and necessary ones. Its surface is warm yellow rather than dull white, faintly fragrant even before the flame touches it. Some swear beeswax burns with a cleaner light because it comes from creatures dearer to heaven than geese. Others say it simply cost more, and therefore must be praised accordingly. Both may be true. You set it in its holder, carry a splinter from the hearth, and coax the wick alive. The candle gives a small, steady light, clear and golden, different from the fire's restless flicker. Together they divide the room between them, the hearth taking the lower half in shifting warmth, the candle laying a calmer brightness over the bench, the chest, your hands, the folded cloth you draw toward you. The loom remains mostly in shadow, tall and silent in the corner, its day suspended until dawn. You sit at the bench with a measured length of thread, a bit of charcoal, and a scrap of board worn smooth enough to receive rough notations. You're no monastery scribe, and the room contains no vellum ledger, no sand shaker, no neat rows of figures in an elegant hand. What you have is memory, touch, and enough marks to keep memory from lying too freely. That is the more common arithmetic of the world. The monks may count souls and rents by columns. The rest of you count by need, habit, and what remains after winter takes its share. First the thread. You lift the skeins and examine what was spun today, what was bought from the peddler, what remains from earlier work. Each has its own feel. Your fingers know the homespun by its slight unevenness, the bought thread by its tighter confidence, the older store by its faint dryness. You separate them carefully, laying one beside another. There's never as much as you would prefer and almost always more confusion than you expected. Thread disappears into hems, bindings, repairs, and those mysterious vanishments common to households where children exist. The older woman comes near and names what she remembers without hesitation. Enough left for the neighbour woman's seam. Enough perhaps for the manor servant's plain request if the weaving goes well tomorrow. Not enough, certainly, for any foolish extravagance like decorative bands or unnecessary trimming. That much was obvious already. You nod and make your marks. Then the cloth itself. You measure the woven length with your hands, finger width by finger width, then again more carefully against the cord you keep for such judgments. It is good cloth, plain, even, serviceable. The repaired place from the broken thread still lives in your memory, though under candlelight it lies quiet and hard to see unless you know where to look. You pass your hand over the surface once, feeling the firmness of it, the day embedded in it morning chill, noon market voices, afternoon rain. The patient anger of snapped thread, all translated now into woven steadiness. Some swear cloth remembers the weaver's mood, that sour hands make sour garments, and calm hands make kinder ones. No one can quite agree whether this is wisdom or comforting nonsense, but you find yourself hoping the cloth at least remembers your persistence. The newly dyed piece draws the eye next. You rise and check it where it hangs, still damp in the deeper folds, but taking beautifully enough for village standards. It may fade with washing, as all good medieval hopes eventually do, but for now it glows in the candlelight like stored warmth. You imagine it cut into a hood or lining. Imagine it crossing the lane on someone's shoulders in colder weather, carrying a little quiet evening fire with it. Such thoughts are not profitable, but they are difficult to prevent. Then coin. There is not much of it, which simplifies some things and complicates others. A small purse, a few pieces, and some values held not in metal, but in expectation mending owed, cloth promised, an egg count remembered, a loaf to be returned, a skein bought on thin bargaining, perhaps a favour from the fuller come next market if the weather holds and the bridge does not disgrace itself again. Medieval economy often resembles a spider's web drawn by someone with cold hands. It holds, somehow, but rarely in straight lines. You pour the coins onto the bench. The candlelight catches their edges weakly. Their surfaces are worn, stamped faces and crosses rubbed thin by other hands before yours. You move them into little groups, a sum for salt, a sum to keep against winter onions if prices rise, a sum already half promised in your mind toward lamp oil or more thread, and beyond that, not much, enough to continue, not enough to relax. That balance defines more households than any sermon ever could. The older woman watches without hovering, which is a form of respect. She asks whether the peddler's thread was worth the price after all. Worth the weather, you say? She accepts that. Prices are judged partly by quality, partly by timing, and partly by how miserable the road was when the bargain happened. On a dry day, a man's wares may be overpriced. In drizzle, carrying his whole shop on his back, they become almost reasonable. Commerce has its own saints, and most of them are damp. The child, hearing coins, wanders closer with sleepy interest. They ask whether there will be enough for a sweet bun at the next market. The question floats in the candlelight with all the innocence of someone who has never had to choose between thread and onions. Maybe, you say, this is both kind and mathematically irresponsible. Somewhere outside, a voice carries down the lane, then another answers, both softer than before. Evening has laid a blanket over the village. Doors are shut, fires are tended, hens are enclosed against foxes, theft and their own poor judgment. The priory bell sounds once more, distant through the dark and the damp, marking an hour that monks keep in choir while villagers keep it in sore backs and banked hearths. The sound enters the room and seems to rest there a moment among the thread. The candle and your small domestic figures. You think then, not for the first time, of how tightly craft and worry are twisted together. People speak fondly of good work, of skill, of old trades handed down through families, as though labour were some noble river carrying identity smoothly forward. They say less about the little gnawing mathematics underneath it, enough wool, enough daylight, enough thread, enough fuel to dye, enough coin to wait for payment, enough patience to keep producing something steady in a world that seems organised chiefly to interrupt steadiness. Still, the marks on the board grow. The figures resolve as much as they can. The cloth is counted. The thread is sorted. The peddler's purchase is absorbed into the household's future. The neighbour woman's repair becomes real in your mind. The manor servant's request sits heavily but not impossibly at the edge of tomorrow. This is what accounts do. They do not lessen burdens, they merely give them names. There are old sayings about evening reckonings. Some swear you should never count coin after full dark lest it invite loss. Others insist that measuring cloth by candlelight flatters the weave and leads to quarrels later. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, which is convenient, since poor households must count whenever work permits and quarrels arrive without needing an invitation. Still, you find yourself turning one coin over 3 times before setting it down, just to be sure. Just because certainty is precious and candles are finite. At length the reckoning ends. Not because everything is settled, but because enough is known for one night. The coins return to the purse, the thread is wrapped, the board with its rough marks is set near the chest. The candle burns lower by a little, its beeswax scent mingling with smoke, damp wool, and the faint herbal memory of the dye pot. You lean back and feel the bench beneath you, the heat at your shins, the day's fatigue like a cloak settling more honestly around the shoulders than any cloth could. The older woman begins laying out what will be needed in the morning with that infuriating competence which makes tomorrow appear already underway. The child has folded sideways against the dog, who accepts this burden with stoic resignation. The dyed cloth hangs quietly. The loom waits in shadow, and you, having counted thread, measured cloth, and peered into the narrow purse of your little world, let your hands go still at last in the candlelight, knowing there is enough for now. Though only just. The reckoning is done, or at least done enough to let the night proceed without anyone pretending certainty has suddenly become abundant. The purse is tied, the thread is wrapped and set aside. The rough board with its charcoal marks leans near the chest, ready to accuse no one until morning. The beeswax candle burns with a steady, thinning patience, its flame smaller now but cleaner than the fire, and together they hold the room in 2 kinds of evening light, the hearth breathing low and warm, the candle shining calmly over the bench, the hanging cloth, the rim of the pot, the older woman's hands. You feel the day in your fingers most of all. Not pain exactly, not in any dramatic sense, but that deep, dull stiffness that comes after repeated labour has folded itself into the joints. Your thumbs feel thick. The base of each finger carries a faint pulse of use. Your wrists remember the loom. Your shoulders remember the bench. Even the groove worn by the spindle earlier has not entirely faded from one finger, a small mark left behind like the trace of a habit on the body. You open and close your hand once by the firelight and watch the knuckles move with the reluctance of men called back to work before dawn. Supper comes quietly, as all the best village suppers do when people are tired enough not to interfere with them. The older woman brings the pot forward again, and the scent of it reaches you before the bowl does barley, onion, perhaps a little cabbage, the memory of herbs from the drying bunch above the hearth, and beneath it all that plain, comforting warmth which matters more than richness after a long damp day. Coarse bread is cut, not much, but enough. A bit of cheese, hard at the edge and stronger than politeness, is set out on the board. There may be a scrap of smoked fish too, thinly divided, because medieval households are experts at making scarcity look like order if one does not inspect too closely. You sit nearer the fire than before, not from greed, but because heat and food belong together at this hour. The child has nearly fallen asleep where they sat and must be coaxed upright with a promise of broth. The dog, who has spent the better part of the day conducting himself as if only loosely attached to humanity, rises now with sudden spiritual conviction that supper concerns him deeply. He stations himself nearby with all the composed hope of a pilgrim at a shrine. Bowls are filled, bread is passed, the candlelight touches the steam and makes it briefly golden. The first spoonful settles into you with almost embarrassing effectiveness. It is not a feast. No minstrel would compose anything in its honour. Yet after the cold dawn, the loom, the rain, the snapped thread, the peddler's damp charm, the dye steam, the accounts, this bowl feels like the day for giving you a little. The broth is thin, yes, but hot. The barley softens. The onion has almost melted into sweetness. The cabbage is humble but earnest. You dip bread into it and let the crust surrender slowly. No one speaks for a moment. Supper in a working house often begins in this near silence, not from gloom but from concentration. Hunger has its own etiquette. The child slurps and is corrected without malice. The dog receives a crust and then another so small it counts more as moral encouragement than nourishment. The older woman eats steadily, eyes already half on tomorrow's needs even while the spoon is in her hand. You suspect she could plan winter stores, measure cloth, and silently judge the entire lane all at once without ever lowering the bowl. Smoke drifts gently upward. The soot-black rafters catch the firelight in patches. The newly dyed cloth hangs nearby, almost dry now, its muted brown gold deepening warmly in the room. The loom stands farther back in shadow, no longer the centre of the world, merely a tall, dark shape waiting for morning to restore its authority. The rain has nearly stopped outside. Now and then a drop falls from the eaves, but mostly the village has entered that softer hush that follows weather and work alike. You tear off another piece of bread and listen. A door closes somewhere down the lane. A voice murmurs, then fades. Farther off, a cart axle groans once, then no more. The priory bell rings again, distant through the wet dark, carrying the hour over roof and hedge and field, as if even now someone must be reminded that time continues whether supper is finished or not. It blends with the small sounds in the room, the spoon against pottery, the child's sleepy breathing, the low crackle from the hearth. Night sounds through timber and wall are never grand, but they are intimate. A person living by them learns the world by fragments. Your hands rest around the bowl between bites, grateful for the heat. The stiffness in them seems to ease a little. You rub one thumb along the rim and feel where the skin has roughened from thread and beam and spindle. Some swear soaking sore hands in warm ale with rosemary draws out the ache. Others claim goose grease and crushed comfrey leaves work better if wrapped overnight. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, though most remedies are tried eventually because hands are a poor household's most fragile tools and the only ones that cannot be borrowed from a neighbour. The older woman notices you flexing your fingers and says, without looking up, use the salve later. There is indeed a little pot of something near the chest, made from herbs and fat and confidence, which in village medicine is often enough to begin. You nod. It may help. It may simply smell medicinal enough to encourage hope. Either way, it will be used. The child, having recovered just enough wakefulness to ask questions, looks toward the hanging cloth and says it looks richer by candlelight than it did before. This is true. Everything looks a little richer by candlelight, including people's estimates of their own good judgment. You say so, and the older woman almost smiles. Then the child asks whether fine lords and ladies eat suppers like this in great halls. You glance at the bowl, the bread, the dog gazing upward with tragic devotion, the damp cloak by the door, the rushes flattened across the floor. Yes, you say dryly, only with fewer leaks and more musicians. The child laughs, then coughs on the broth, which is about the correct response to most jokes in a medieval household. Somewhere in the warm dimness of the room, the day begins to loosen its hold. It does not disappear. The aches remain. Tomorrow's weaving has not magically woven itself. The manor servant will still want his plain length. The neighbour's worn seam still waits to be mended. Market tolls remain unpopular. The bridge remains unreliable. Yet at supper these things recede just enough to allow breathing room. The bowl in your hands, the warmth on your face, the steady small company of those sharing the room, these hold back worry for a little while. You find yourself looking around at the ordinary treasures of the place. The oak chest with its iron key, the beeswax candle leans slightly in its holder, the patched blanket folded by the wall, the bunch of drying herbs, the spoon with one old burn mark near the handle, the dyed cloth now almost dry, the dog's ears twitching at every crumb, the child fighting sleep with all the doomed courage of the very young. Such things do not seem grand while you live among them. Only later, perhaps. Would anyone call them tender? Outside, the lane has grown dark enough that you can no longer make out the broken cartwheel by the ditch, though you know it is there. The little roadside shrine has vanished from sight as well, but not from memory. It waits in the dark with its faded saint, its wax drippings, its dried herbs, and its bent pilgrim badge, gathering the wishes and anxieties of people too practical not to be a little superstitious. Some swear the first silence after supper belongs to the dead if you do not fill it quickly. Others say that is nonsense spread by old storytellers, hoping not to lose their audience. Even now, it is hard to tell whether such beliefs survive because people trust them, or because evenings are long and fear likes company. You finish the broth slowly, scraping the last grains with bread. Waste is still unthinkable. The older woman clears bowls as they empty, moving with quieter motions now. The child leans against your arm once, briefly, then rights themselves as if remembering dignity at the last moment. You break the final heel of bread and pass a bit to the dog, who receives it as if absolved of many sins. The fire settles lower but redder. Supper leaves behind not silence exactly, but a softened room. Voices, if they rise at all now, do so low and unhurried. No one has the energy for dispute. Even complaint begins to feel like unnecessary embroidery. You sit there with your hands loose in your lap and feel the stiffness return now that the bowl's warmth is gone. The shoulders, especially, the neck, the small knot low in the back from leaning and lifting and sitting at the loom. This, too, is part of the evening. Labour does not merely end, it echoes. It continues in the body after the tools are set down, much the way the priory bell continues faintly in the ear after the last note. The older woman brings the little salve pot and sets it beside you. It smells of herbs crushed into fat, sharp and earthy and faintly bitter. You work a little into your fingers and wrists. The grease shines briefly in the candlelight. The smell is strong enough to convince you it must either heal or chase off every lesser demon in the county. The child wrinkles their nose. The dog sneezes. Both responses suggest potency. At length the bowls are stacked. The bread cloth is folded and the spoon is wiped. The room has crossed fully from work into evening rest, though rest in such a house means only that the tasks have changed from urgent to quiet. You remain seated by the hearth, hands salved, stomach warm, eyes growing heavier in the flicker. Around you the familiar room closes in more gently now. Smoke, firelight, wool, herbs, old wood, candle wax. And in that hush, with supper finished and stiff hands slowly easing, the long day begins at last to feel survivable. The bowls have been cleared, the bread cloth folded, the salve worked into your fingers until your hands smell like an argument between a hedge and a kitchen, and the room settles into that particular hush only evening can make. Not silence, never silence. A medieval house is too honest for that. Timber ticks softly as it cools. A coal slips in the hearth and gives a low red sigh. The dog resettles with all the elaborate effort of a creature who's done almost nothing all day and feels entitled to recover from it fully. The child drifts at the edge of sleep, then startles awake, then drifts again, resisting night with the doomed dignity of the very young. You remain near the fire a while longer, not because there is any real leisure in it, but because your body now insists on stillness in a way it could not earlier. The long repetition of the loom has worked itself into you. Even at rest, your shoulders remember their forward bend. Your wrists feel the ghost of motion. Your feet, tucked nearer the warmth, seem to expect the bench and treadles again. A day of weaving does not stop when the hands go still. It lingers in the joints like weather in old wood. The beeswax candle has burned lower, but its light is gentler now, softer around the edges. It touches the dyed cloth where it hangs near the hearth, now nearly dry and deepened into a warm dusk brown that seems richer by firelight than it ever did by day. It glances off the iron key on the chest, the rim of the empty pot, the curve of the spoon laid to dry. The loom remains in shadow, tall and patient in the corner, not menacing exactly, but impossible to forget. It looks almost monastic now. A dark wooden structure waiting for dawn as monks wait for bells. Outside, the village has become a world of muffled hints. Through the wall you hear a door shut somewhere down the lane. Then another. A late voice murmurs, too faint to make out. Perhaps someone calling in a child. Perhaps someone offering a last complaint to a neighbour who has no energy left to disagree. A cart passes far off, its wheels no longer rattling but dragging softly through mud. Then even that is gone, and the village folds itself inward. The priory bell comes at last through the dark and damp, slower in your ear than it was in daylight, though of course it rings the same. It rolls over roof, hedge, and sleeping field, thinned by distance and weather, yet clear enough to place the hour inside your chest. You have heard it since before dawn. It marked your first cold step onto the rushes, your breath over the hearth, your spinning, your weaving, your walk through the lane, the rain, the dye pot, the accounts, the supper bowl. Now it reaches you again, and the whole day seems to gather around it for a moment like thread pulled taut on the loom. The child, half asleep now, lifts their head and asks whether monks ever sleep. Only in shifts, you murmur. This earns a small huff of laughter from the older woman, which in her case is almost a performance. The child smiles drowsily and lets the question go. There are many things in this world children ask because they want facts, and many more because they want the comfort of hearing a familiar voice answer. Night questions belong mostly to the second kind. You lean back slightly, careful of the bench, and let your gaze move around the room. The patched blanket by the wall, the bunch of herbs above the hearth, the dyed cloth, the half-burned candle, the chest, the loom, the dog, the child. The older woman folding one last small cloth with the grave precision of someone who has spent a lifetime refusing to let disorder breed overnight. It is all so ordinary that it almost escapes notice. And yet ordinary things are the ones that hold a life together, not feasts, not fairs, not the rare bright moment travellers boast of later. A house survives on folded cloth, banked coals, mended seams, saved candles, and people who know where the bucket goes when the roof remembers it is mortal. The salve warms your fingers now, or perhaps the fire does. Or perhaps the ache is simply softening because it has run out of reasons to argue. You flex your hand once more. Better. Not healed, exactly, but brought back into tolerable service, which is the nearest thing to luxury most tools ever receive in this age. Some swear you should never go to sleep with weaving stiff hands unblessed, lest the cramps wake you before dawn and set bad luck in the next day's thread. Others say a good rub with herbs and fat is blessing enough. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. You do not test the matter. You murmur a brief prayer anyway, half habit, half insurance, and that seems a sensible compromise. At last it is time to lie down. This, too, is done slowly. The child is guided toward the bedding, blinking and pliant. The older woman banks the fire, drawing ash over the lower glow so it will hold till morning. The beeswax candle is pinched out at the right moment. Not too soon. Not after wasteful burning. And for an instant the room changes sharply, losing its clear gold and falling back into the red-brown language of embers. Shadows swell. The loom disappears almost entirely. The dyed cloth becomes only a darker shape in the dimness. The air is warmer near the hearth, colder by the door, and threaded through with that familiar mixture of smoke, wool, herbs, damp timber, and old night. You lower yourself onto the bedding with the caution of someone whose bones have kept count all day. The straw beneath the blanket is flattened and uneven, but familiar enough that your body accepts it without complaint. The wool blanket comes over you with that particular heaviness only wool has. Not light, not soft in any delicate sense, but dependable. Dependable matters more. It smells faintly of smoke and lanolin and the dry air of earlier winters. A good blanket is less romance than treaty between flesh and cold, between sleep and the night pressing at the walls. The child is asleep almost at once, because children conduct all their resistance loudly and then vanish into dreams with insulting speed. The dog circles twice and collapses near the doorway, sighing with the moral exhaustion of one who has guarded an entire threshold from nothing visible. The older woman settles last, after one final glance toward the hearth, the hanging cloth, the chest, the door. Households have their own rituals of trust. Hers consists mostly of checking everything twice and believing nothing good comes from optimism. You lie there awake, not unhappily, simply not yet gone from the day. This is when the night sounds begin to separate themselves. The drip into the bucket near the wall, now infrequent but still there. A soft scratching from somewhere in the rafters that might be mouse, memory, or both. The wind touching the outside of the house lightly, not strong enough to threaten, only enough to remind you that beyond the walls are lane, field, shrine, ditch, priory rise, and the whole cold breadth of the world. Once, far off. A dog answers another dog and then thinks better of continuing. Somewhere a horse stamps in a byre, somewhere a shutter knocks and is stilled. And beneath all of it, quieter but more persistent, is the loom. Not truly, of course. The loom stands dark and motionless in the corner, yet in your body, in your hearing, it continues. Lift, pass, catch, beat. The rhythm has entered you so thoroughly that now, lying still under the blanket, you can feel it echoing through the shoulders and wrists, through the grooves of thought itself. Repetitive labour leaves this gift. If gift is the word long after the hands rest, the pattern goes on. You think of the day in fragments rather than order. The frost at the bucket rim before dawn, the first crust of bread, the spindle turning, the broken cartwheel by the ditch, the little shrine with its dried herbs and bent pilgrim badge, the market voices near the well, the rain on the roof, the snapped thread and your annoyance at its small dry pop, the peddler with his pack and his doubtful charm, the dyed cloth breathing steam by the fire, the coins on the bench in beeswax light, supper, salve, this bed, all of it now folded into darkness, as if the day itself has become cloth and is being put away. Even now, it is hard to tell whether a life like this feels longer because every day resembles the one before it, or shorter because repetition smooths the edges between them. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, yet lying here, with the warmth of the banked hearth still reaching faintly across the room, you suspect both may be true. Days repeat, but they do not vanish. They accumulate. A shoulder learns them, a hand remembers, a room carries them in smell and wear. A loom holds them in polished wood. The priory bell comes once more, much later now, thinner, lonelier, but still obedient to its office. You listen until the note fades. Then you listen to the quiet after it, the soft breathing in the room, the tiny settling sounds of a house not asleep so much as resting watchfully against the dark. Your eyes grow heavier at last. The blanket warms. The straw beneath you stops feeling uneven and becomes simply there. The last sharpness leaves your hands. The day loosens one thread at a time, and in the dim red hush of embers, with bells far off, and the remembered clatter of the loom slowly sinking beneath sleep, you lie still and let the night gather over you like another layer of wool. Sleep does not take you all at once. It rarely does after a day like this. Your body lies down, yes, and the blanket settles, and the banked hearth gives its low red warmth into the room, but the mind lingers behind a little, reluctant to stop turning where the hands have already stopped. For a while you remain in that narrow place between waking and rest, where the dark house feels both familiar and strange, and every small sound carries farther than it should. The embers pulse softly in the hearth, not flame now, only a breathing glow beneath ash, enough to paint the nearest stones in red and leave the rest of the room to softer shadow. The loom is mostly gone from sight, yet not from presence. It stands in the corner as it has stood all evening, tall and quiet, a dark shape folded into darkness, waiting with all the patience of wood and habit. The dyed cloth nearby hangs almost still, no longer damp. Its colour lost now except where the ember glow touches its edge and turns it for an instant to warm brown before letting it sink back into night. You lie on your side and listen. The bucket by the wall receives one last lazy drop from the roof. Somewhere in the rafters, something small shifts, then settles. The dog near the doorway gives a sleepy huff as if objecting, even in dreams, to matters of household management. The child breathes in that deep, absolute way only the young manage, as though sleep were not something entered but something owned. The older woman's breathing is slower, lighter, still carrying the faint alertness of those who've kept houses long enough to distrust peace that comes too easily. Outside, the village has almost entirely gone under. The lane is no more than darkness beyond the door. The broken cart wheel by the ditch is out there somewhere, glossed now by the rain that has passed, unnoticed by all but memory. The roadside shrine with its faded saint wax drippings, dried herbs, and bent pilgrim badge waits in the blackness beyond the hedges, gathering mist, prayer, and the small borrowed faith of passers-by. The priory on the rise is hidden too. Yet from time to time its bells still reach you, each note thin and patient across the wet fields. You hear one now. It comes through the night like a thread drawn carefully through cloth, not loud, not demanding, only certain. The bell does not care whether you're rich, poor, warm, sore, pious, doubtful, or asleep. It marks the hour for all of you alike, for monks under stone vaults, for shepherds in low huts, for servants in manor outbuildings, for women mending by dying light, for men who spent the day at looms and now lie under wool blankets with tired hands smelling faintly of herbs. It sounds, and the dark receives it, and after a moment the note fades until only memory continues it. You close your eyes and open them again. This is the last wakeful stretch, the one in which tomorrow begins to gather at the edge of thought before sleep can properly forbid it. You think, not in full sentences now, only in pieces. The plain cloth still on the loom, the manor servant wanting his serviceable length, the neighbour woman's worn seam waiting to be mended, the bought skein from the peddler, the child's question about sweet buns at the next market, the old board with charcoal marks leaning by the chest. Enough thread. Perhaps. Enough cloth soon. Enough coin for some things, not for others. Tomorrow, like every tomorrow here, is already asking quietly from the dark. And yet the thought does not trouble you the way it might have earlier. Perhaps that is the true lesson of such a life. Not that repetition becomes easy, but that it becomes familiar enough to stop being frightening. Dawn will come. The frost may return to the bucket rim. The priory bell will sound again. You will rise from flattened straw and cooling ash. The hearth will need coaxing. Bread will be cut. Hands will be warmed. Wool will be touched, turned, drawn, spun, woven. The same motions will wait, and the same small uncertainties beside them: weather, coin, thread, rent, hunger, repairs. Yet because they come again and again, they become less like intruders and more like the weathered beams of the house itself, never entirely welcome. Perhaps, but known. No one can quite agree whether the hardest part of a medieval life is the labour, the cold, or the certainty that tomorrow will look so much like today. Some say it is the sameness that wears people thin. Others say the sameness is what saves them, because a known hardship is easier to shoulder than a new one. Lying here now, with the blanket heavy over you and the last warmth of the fire touching the edge of the room, it seems possible that both are true. Repetition is the burden, yes, but it is also the handrail. You shift slightly beneath the blanket and feel the day still in your body, not sharply anymore, only as a deep, soft heaviness. Your shoulders no longer ache so much as remember. Your fingers are no longer stiff so much as used. Your neck and back, your knees, your tired feet, all seem to settle deeper into the bedding, as though the whole body is lowering itself into rest one honest layer at a time. Even the smell of your own sleeves, smoke, wool, rain-damp air, lanolin. A trace of the salve has become part of the comfort. There is something almost holy in such plain exhaustion. Not grand holiness, nothing manuscript painters would trouble to gild, but the humble kind that lives in repeated duty carried without witness. A monk may chant through the hours, a noble may give alms where others can see. A weaver rises in the dark, keeps thread from breaking more often than not, turns wool into cloth, counts scant coins by beeswax light, and lies down to do it again. The world rarely sings about that, yet the world wears it all the same. The bell sounds once more, farther now in your drifting mind. Your thoughts move more slowly and they lose their edges. You imagine the village sleeping around you, each house holding its own small weather of breath and ash and animal warmth. Somewhere a baby stirs and is soothed. Somewhere an old man coughs beneath a patched blanket. Somewhere a widow turns the last of a candle down before lying beside a cold place in the bed that no longer surprises her. Somewhere in the manor a servant folds cloth by kitchen light, and somewhere behind priory walls a monk bends one last time over an inked page before the candle gutters. All of them, in one way or another, are held together by woven things: sleeves, hoods, blankets, wrappings, sacks, altar cloths, saddle pads, winter cloaks, strips of mending, ribbons saved too long, and plain lengths made in rooms like yours by hands too tired to boast. Those who tell the tale never fully agree about whether a life must be exciting to be meaningful, but the dark has its own answer. Here, in this room, meaning lives in quieter places, in cloth that holds, in bread shared, in a roof that leaks only a little, in a dog that stays, in herbs drying over the hearth, in a child asleep, in the old woman who checked the fire twice, in the loom waiting for morning, in your own tired hands, finally still, and gradually, almost without noticing the exact moment, your thoughts stop circling tomorrow and begin simply floating. The blanket is warmer now. The room is dimmer. The ember glow has sunk lower. The sounds outside have thinned to almost nothing, just the occasional touch of wind against the wall and the far, faded suggestion of wet leaves shifting beyond the lane. The bucket will keep its place. The cloth will wait on the loom. The dyed piece will dry fully before dawn. The board with its little charcoal marks will still lean by the chest. Nothing needs you for these next few hours. That, more than comfort, is what sleep requires, the brief mercy of being unneeded. So you let go. You let go of the snapped thread and the repaired place hidden in the weave. You let go of the market voices and the steward's man and the peddler with his damp wares. You let go of the rain on the roof, the steam from the dye pot, the coins in candlelight, the broth bowl warming your palms, the ache in your shoulders, the smell of wet wool, the bell across the fields. You let go of the whole long, repetitive day, and it drifts away from you not as hardship now, but as texture like woven cloth passing softly through the hands. And as sleep finally reaches you, it does not feel like falling. It feels like settling, like embers easing under ash, like rainwater finding stillness in a bucket, like thread drawn home at last. The night deepens around the house, around the village, around the road and field and shrine and priory bell. The loom waits in darkness. Tomorrow waits behind it. But for now there is only this dim room, this wool blanket, this quiet breath, this final loosening of body and thought into rest. And the rest, until morning, belongs to sleep. The warmth left in the hearth grows gentler still, and the room seems to breathe with you, slow and faint and steady. Nothing asks anything more of you now. Not the cloth, not the weather, not the lane, not the little arithmetic of thread and bread and winter stores. All of that has gone soft at the edges. All of it has stepped back. You drift deeper. The dark is no longer empty. It is padded, familiar, lined with wool and smoke and the hush of old timber. The day has folded itself away. Even the memory of the loom's clatter has thinned to something distant and harmless, like a cart heard from across a valley. The bells, when they come again, seem farther off than fields, farther off than weather, scarcely more than a kindness moving through the dark. If tomorrow resembles today, and the next day resembles tomorrow, perhaps that is not only the burden of this life, but also its quiet comfort, this same floor underfoot, the same hearthstone, the same wool blanket, the same bell beyond the mist, the same patient work waiting in the morning light. There is peace, after a fashion, in knowing where the day will begin. So the night closes gently, the house holds, the embers dim, and you sleep. Now the world becomes softer, dimmer, warmer. The fields beyond the lane disappear into a kind of velvety black, and the hedges, the shrine, the ditch, the old wheel by the road all sink beneath the same tender darkness, as if the whole village has been tucked in beneath one vast, worn blanket. The priory bell is only a distant memory now. The dog dreams. The child does not stir. The loom keeps its silence. Your breathing deepens, and the long plain labour of the day fades until it is no heavier than the wool laid over you. There is nothing left to mend tonight, nothing left to count, nothing left to carry. Only the last hush of embers, the faint scent of beeswax and herbs and smoke, and the deep, kind darkness gathering close around the bed. You're safe enough for this hour, warm enough, resting enough. The roughness of the day has been softened by shadow, and even the old aches seem to loosen and drift away into the dark corners of the room where they can do no harm. So you sleep on while the village sleeps with you under roofs that hold, under roofs that leak, beneath blankets fine and rough, behind oak doors and thin shutters, beside hearths red and fading, all of you carried together through the same quiet night. And somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the wet road, beyond the low dark roofs, time keeps moving softly on, but you do not need to follow it now. You only need to rest. You only need to be still. You only need to let the darkness hold you a little longer, until dawn comes creeping back over the frost and the smoke and the waiting loom.